Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. What kind of ruler inherits a kingdom already living on borrowed time, and then learns before reaching manhood that his own body will fail him long before his enemies do? Tonight's story begins not with a clash of armies or a coronation procession, but with a quiet realization that would shape an entire reign and alter the fate of a fragile kingdom perched between faiths and empires. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The kingdom at the center of this story was young, anxious, and constantly alert. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, founded in the wake of the First Crusade, was not yet a century old when Baldwin was born into it. It was a narrow strip of territory along the eastern Mediterranean, defended by castles, treaties, and a constant readiness for war. Its rulers were Western Christians, governing a land where the majority population followed other faiths and customs. Every harvest, every caravan, every border movement mattered. Stability was never assumed. It had to be renewed each season. Baldwin was born in 1161. The son of King Amalric I and Agnes of Courtenay. From the beginning, his life unfolded inside a court where politics was inseparable from family. Royal marriages were strategic tools, regencies were common, and childhoods were shaped by expectations of rule or alliance. Baldwin was not raised with the luxury of imagining a private future. He was a prince of Jerusalem, and that meant preparation for leadership, whether he wished it or not. As a boy, Baldwin received the education expected of a future ruler. He learned scripture, Latin, and the customs of Frankish nobility transplanted into the Levant. He was trained to ride, to observe military drills, and to understand the layered obligations of kingship. His tutor, William of Tyre, later a respected chronicler, noticed early that Baldwin possessed a sharp and attentive mind. He listened carefully, remembered details, and showed a seriousness beyond his years. Yet something else became apparent during these lessons, something quiet and unsettling. While playing with other boys, Baldwin showed an unusual indifference to pain. When struck or scratched, he did not react as expected. At first, this seemed like a curious trait, perhaps even a sign of toughness. But William of Tyre, trained in observation as much as teaching, grew concerned. Loss of sensation was not a gift in the medieval world, it was a warning. Over time, the signs became clearer. Numbness spread. Minor injuries healed poorly. The diagnosis, once understood, carried a heavy weight: leprosy. In the 12th century, leprosy was feared not only for its physical effects but for its social and moral associations. It was poorly understood, often linked unfairly to divine judgment. Many who suffered from it were isolated, removed from public life, or forced into religious communities. For a royal child, the implications were severe. Kings were expected to lead armies, appear in public rituals, and embody strength. A disease associated with decay and withdrawal seemed incompatible with the crown. Yet Baldwin was not removed from court, nor hidden away. His illness progressed slowly, and for a time it could be managed discreetly. His father, King Amalric, continued to rule, and Baldwin remained a prince among many concerns of state. Still, the knowledge settled quietly among those closest to him. The future king of Jerusalem would not grow into the kind of ruler tradition imagined. Amalric's reign was marked by near-constant diplomatic and military pressure. To the south lay Egypt, weakened but still influential. To the east and north, Muslim leaders were increasingly coordinated, especially under figures who would soon reshape the region. The kingdom relied on alliances with other Crusader states, on military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers, and on reinforcements from Europe that arrived unpredictably. In this environment, succession was not an abstract concern. It was a matter of survival. When Amalric died in 1174, Baldwin was only 13. Despite his age and illness, there was no serious alternative. The law and custom of the kingdom favoured direct succession, and Baldwin was crowned king in Jerusalem. The ceremony itself followed established forms, but the atmosphere was cautious rather than celebratory. A child with a known, incurable disease now wore a crown that demanded endurance. Because of his youth, Baldwin ruled under a regency. Authority passed first to Miles of Plancy, then more securely to Raymond III of Tripoli, a seasoned noble with experience and ambition. These arrangements were meant to preserve stability, but they also introduced tension. Regents ruled in the king's name, but their own priorities inevitably shaped policy. Baldwin, meanwhile, observed. He learned how power was exercised, how decisions were justified, and how alliances shifted. Even as a teenager, Baldwin did not remain passive. Contemporary accounts suggest he paid attention to council discussions and formed opinions early. He understood the geography of his kingdom, the location of its fortresses, and the temperament of its nobles. His illness limited his physical participation, but it did not dull his awareness. As sensation faded in his hands and feet, his reliance on careful planning and judgment increased. The cultural atmosphere of Jerusalem during Baldwin's early reign was complex. Latin Christian rulers governed a city sacred to multiple religions. Arabic, Greek, Armenian, and Latin were spoken in its streets. Merchants from Italy traded alongside local craftsmen. Religious processions passed through neighborhoods where different customs prevailed. This was not a simple frontier outpost, but a layered society held together by law, force, and habit. Within the court, Baldwin's condition was acknowledged but not emphasized publicly. He appeared when he could, presided over ceremonies as required, and maintained the outward forms of kingship. Privately, accommodations were made. Advisors assisted him physically. Duties were adjusted. Over time, it became clear that his reign would be defined not by personal vigor, but by persistence. As Baldwin approached adulthood, the question of how long he could rule and who would follow him became increasingly urgent. His sister Sibylla emerged as a central figure, as did her potential marriages. Every alliance carried consequences. Choosing a husband for a royal woman could elevate one faction and alienate another. Baldwin, aware of his limited time, approached these decisions carefully, though not always successfully. Meanwhile, beyond the borders of Jerusalem, a new power was consolidating. In the Muslim world, leadership that had once been fragmented was becoming more unified. Figures like Saladin were rising through a combination of military skill, political patience, and religious legitimacy. These changes did not immediately translate into invasion, but they altered the strategic landscape. The kingdom Baldwin inherited faced an opponent increasingly capable of sustained pressure. Despite his youth and illness, Baldwin did not retreat from responsibility. He travelled when possible, reviewed defences, and endorsed military actions deemed necessary by his council. His presence, even when physically limited, carried symbolic weight. A king who continued to rule despite visible decline challenged assumptions about authority. He was not the ideal warrior king, but he was undeniably legitimate. This first phase of Baldwin's life sets the tone for what followed. A kingdom accustomed to crisis now had a ruler whose very body reflected fragility. Yet fragility did not mean passivity. Baldwin's early years on the throne were a period of learning, observation, and quiet resolve. He absorbed the realities of power without illusions. He understood that time was not on his side, and that every decision mattered more because of it. The story moves forward from here, not towards sudden drama, but toward the steady accumulation of choices and consequences. Baldwin's reign would be shaped by illness, yes, but also by intelligence, restraint, and moments of unexpected firmness. The Leper King had emerged, not as a tragic symbol, but as a living ruler, navigating a kingdom that could not afford weakness, least of all from its crown. A king crowned too young. The crown placed upon the head of King Baldwin IV did not rest easily, and it was never meant to. Jerusalem in 1174 did not expect comfort from its rulers. It expected vigilance, continuity, and enough authority to keep rival ambitions from tearing the kingdom apart. Baldwin's coronation answered one urgent question: who would rule, but it immediately raised several others. How long could a child reign in a land that demanded adult judgment? And how much authority could truly belong to a king whose body was already failing him? Because Baldwin was still in his early teens, the kingdom reverted to a familiar structure: regency. This was not unusual in the Crusader states, where deaths were frequent and heirs often young. Yet, in Baldwin's case, the arrangement carried additional weight. Everyone understood that this was not simply a temporary measure until adulthood. His illness made the duration of his rule uncertain, and uncertainty bred competition. At first, authority fell to Miles of Plancy, a powerful noble who moved quickly to assert control. His regency was brief and unpopular, marked by suspicion and political tension. Within months, he was assassinated, a reminder that Jerusalem's politics could turn lethal without warning. Stability returned only when Raymond III of Tripoli was appointed regent. Raymond was experienced, widely respected, and cautious. He had previously been king in Tripoli and understood both diplomacy and war. For the moment, the kingdom breathed more easily. Under Raymond's regency, Baldwin was not sidelined. He was present at court, attended councils, and listened carefully. Though legally a minor, he was treated as a future ruler rather than a ceremonial figure. Chroniclers note that he showed patience and attentiveness, qualities that served him well as he absorbed the mechanics of power. He learned how decisions were framed, how compromises were justified, and how delays could be as strategic as action. The regency also shaped Baldwin's understanding of authority. He saw that ruling was rarely a matter of personal will alone. Power flowed through networks, nobles, church officials, military orders, and foreign allies. A king who ignored these realities quickly lost relevance. Baldwin's illness, which limited his physical presence, reinforced this lesson. He would need loyalty more than spectacle, trust more than intimidation. As he grew older, Baldwin's condition progressed unevenly. Some days allowed near-normal activity, others brought pain, weakness, or numbness that made simple movements difficult. Medieval medicine offered little relief. Treatments focused on managing symptoms rather than cure. The court adapted quietly. Horses were chosen for gentler riding. Armor was adjusted or avoided altogether. Baldwin learned to conserve strength, both physical and political. Despite these limitations, he reached the age when kings were expected to rule in their own right. Around 1176, Baldwin formally assumed personal authority, though Raymond remained influential. This transition was delicate. Too abrupt a shift risked alienating experienced nobles. Too slow a withdrawal of the regent's power undermined the king's legitimacy. Baldwin navigated this carefully, asserting himself in matters he understood best while relying on counsel where necessary. One of the defining features of Baldwin's early independent rule was his insistence on being seen. He appeared in public ceremonies when possible, reinforcing the image of continuity. In a society where legitimacy depended heavily on visible authority, absence could be interpreted as weakness. Baldwin's presence, even when supported or physically limited, sent a clear message: the king still ruled. The broader political environment remained tense. The kingdom's borders were tested regularly by raids and skirmishes. These were not full-scale invasions but constant reminders of vulnerability. Baldwin approved defensive measures, castle reinforcements, and patrols. He understood that deterrence depended on readiness. Even without leading armies personally, he shaped strategy through endorsement and restraint. Internally, factions began to coalesce. Some nobles favoured aggressive expansion or confrontation, believing that strength lay in bold action. Others preferred diplomacy and truce, aware that resources were limited. Baldwin did not align himself fully with either camp. His decisions often reflected a desire to buy time to preserve the kingdom's strength until circumstances clarified. Time, ironically, was the one resource he himself lacked. Succession loomed as an unspoken concern. Baldwin could not marry or produce heirs. That responsibility fell to his siblings, particularly his sister Sibylla. Every discussion of marriage became political. Baldwin recognized this and approached the matter with caution. Each potential alliance promised support but risked empowering rivals within the court. The regency period had taught him how easily authority could be contested. As Baldwin's personal rule took shape, his reputation began to shift. He was no longer seen merely as a sickly child king. His steadiness, willingness to listen, and avoidance of reckless decisions earned respect. Chroniclers noted his seriousness and sense of duty. He did not indulge in extravagance or grand displays. His kingship was quieter, defined by continuity rather than transformation. This phase of Baldwin's reign did not bring dramatic change, but it established something essential: confidence. The kingdom learned that it could function under a king who ruled with mind rather than muscle. Baldwin learned that authority did not require constant assertion, only consistency. These lessons would prove vital as pressures increased and choices grew more consequential. The crown that had once seemed an impossible burden settled into place not comfortably, but securely enough. Baldwin IV was no longer merely crowned too young. He was ruling as best he could, within limits he did not choose, guiding a kingdom that could not afford missteps. The Court of Jerusalem. By the time King Baldwin IV entered the fuller exercise of his authority, the Court of Jerusalem had become the true arena of his reign. Battles would come later, and treaties would rise and fall, but day after day, the survival of the kingdom was shaped within chambers of stone and shaded courtyards where voices were lowered, loyalties tested, and decisions weighed carefully. For a king whose body imposed limits, the court was not a substitute for action. It was the central mechanism of rule. The royal court of Jerusalem was unlike any in Western Europe. It was smaller, more precarious, and constantly aware of its surroundings. The city itself sat at the intersection of cultures, religions, and trade routes. Latin Christian nobles governed, but the population included Eastern Christians, Muslims, Jews, Armenians, Syrians, and merchants from across the Mediterranean. This diversity shaped daily governance. Law was not uniform, custom varied by community. The king's court served as the point where these differences were negotiated, restrained, or enforced. At the heart of the court stood the High Court of Jerusalem, the kingdom's principal governing body. It was composed of major nobles, church leaders, and senior officials. This council advised the king, confirmed legal judgments, and sanctioned military action. Baldwin presided when his health allowed, listening more than speaking at first. Over time, his interventions became more deliberate. He had learned that restraint could carry more weight than frequent command. Among the most influential figures were the great barons of the realm. Raymond III of Tripoli remained prominent even after the regency ended. His experience, wealth, and connections made him indispensable. Yet his authority also made him a potential rival. Baldwin understood this duality and treated Raymond with respect without surrendering independence. Their relationship was careful, neither warm nor openly hostile, shaped by shared necessity. Other nobles brought different pressures. The Ibelin family, well established and locally rooted, favoured stability and gradual policy. Newer arrivals from Europe often leaned toward aggressive action, eager for glory or land. Baldwin had to balance these impulses. Too much caution risked appearing weak. Too much aggression threatened exhaustion. The court became the place where these arguments played out repeatedly, often without clear resolution. Church figures also wielded influence. The Patriarch of Jerusalem and senior clergy held moral authority and controlled significant resources. They framed conflicts in religious terms and shaped public perception. Baldwin maintained a respectful but pragmatic relationship with them. He recognized the importance of religious legitimacy, but resisted allowing doctrine to dictate strategy. In a kingdom where faith was inseparable from identity, this balance required constant attention. Military orders added another layer. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller were powerful institutions with their own leadership, wealth, and international connections. They answered nominally to the king, but operated with considerable autonomy. Their fortresses guarded critical routes, and their forces often responded faster than royal levies. Baldwin relied on them, while remaining aware that their priorities did not always align perfectly with those of the crown. Cooperation was essential, but so was caution. Foreign envoys were a regular presence. Messengers from Byzantium, representatives of Italian city-states, and agents from other Crusader territories passed through the court. Each brought proposals, warnings, or requests. Baldwin listened carefully. He understood that Jerusalem could not stand alone. Trade agreements secured supplies, alliances promised reinforcements. Even distant relationships mattered, because isolation meant vulnerability. Within this environment, Baldwin's illness subtly reshaped court culture. Meetings were scheduled around his strength. Councils were sometimes shorter, more focused. Advisors learned to present arguments clearly and concisely. The king's physical limits discouraged theatrical displays and long rhetorical exchanges. Over time, this fostered a style of governance that favoured practicality over ceremony. Baldwin himself adapted. He prepared carefully for council sessions, reviewing matters in advance. He asked precise questions and rarely digressed. Chroniclers describe him as attentive and serious, not given to impulsive decisions. His authority rested less on command and more on consistency. Nobles learned that while he might not dominate discussion, his final approval was decisive. The social life of the court reflected the kingdom's fragile condition. Feasts and celebrations occurred, but they were modest compared to European standards. Resources were finite, and ostentation could provoke resentment or appear irresponsible. Baldwin did not encourage extravagance. His personal habits were restrained. This was partly necessity, partly temperament. In a realm where survival depended on discipline, excess felt out of place. Yet the court was not austere to the point of bleakness. Music, religious observances, and seasonal festivals continued. These moments reinforced continuity and morale. Baldwin attended when possible, aware that visibility mattered. Even limited participation signaled stability. The king's presence reminded observers that the kingdom endured despite challenges. Intrigue, however, never vanished. Factions maneuvered constantly. Marriage alliances, inheritance disputes, and appointments to office were contested. Baldwin's position at the centre of these tensions required careful judgment. He could not afford to alienate major supporters, nor could he allow any single group to dominate. His illness, ironically, made him more vigilant. Knowing that his reign might be shorter than most, he treated each decision as consequential. One of the most sensitive issues was succession. Baldwin's inability to produce heirs meant that the future of the crown rested with his siblings. Discussions about marriage and guardianship unfolded within the court, often indirectly. Baldwin observed reactions carefully. He learned which nobles supported which candidates and why. These dynamics informed later choices, even when immediate action was deferred. The court also served as the kingdom's administrative hub. Records were kept, taxes assessed, and disputes adjudicated. Baldwin took interest in these functions. He understood that military strength depended on economic stability. Ensuring that revenues were collected fairly and used effectively was a quiet but critical task. While less dramatic than battle, administration sustained the kingdom. Cultural exchange shaped daily life. Arabic-speaking officials interacted with Latin nobles. Translators were common. Legal customs blended influences from Europe and the Near East. Baldwin did not attempt to impose uniformity. He accepted diversity as a practical reality. This tolerance was not idealistic, it was functional. A kingdom that alienated its population could not endure. As years passed, Baldwin's health declined gradually. His presence at court became more selective. Trusted deputies handled routine matters, reporting back for approval. This delegation was not abdication. Baldwin remained informed and engaged. He adjusted governance to match his capacity, ensuring continuity without chaos. Observers noted the contrast between the king's physical condition and the steadiness of his rule. He did not inspire awe through spectacle, but through reliability. The court adapted to this rhythm. Decisions emerged from consultation, not command. Authority flowed quietly rather than forcefully. The court of Jerusalem during Baldwin's reign was not glamorous, but it was resilient. It reflected the kingdom itself, diverse, cautious, and constantly negotiating survival. Baldwin's role within it was shaped by limitation, but also by clarity. He knew what he could and could not do, and he built his kingship accordingly. This environment prepared the kingdom for moments when swift action would be required. The habits of consultation, restraint, and planning formed here would later support Baldwin in times of crisis. The court was not merely a backdrop to events. It was the engine through which a fragile crown continued to function. Leprosy and kingship. Illness, when it enters a life so publicly lived, does not remain a private matter. In the case of King Baldwin IV, Leprosy became an unspoken presence in every act of rule, shaping expectations, altering routines, and quietly redefining what kingship meant in a world that valued physical strength as a sign of divine favor. Yet the disease did not eclipse governance, it rearranged it. Baldwin's reign demonstrates how authority could persist, even as the body that carried it weakened. In the 12th century, leprosy was poorly understood. Physicians recognized its symptoms: loss of sensation, lesions, gradual physical deterioration, but they lacked effective treatment. Explanations blended medical observation with moral speculation. Many believed the disease reflected spiritual impurity or divine testing. For ordinary sufferers, this often meant exclusion from society. For a king, exclusion was impossible. Jerusalem could not afford a ruler who vanished from view, and Baldwin could not surrender his role without risking chaos. The court adopted a quiet pragmatism. Baldwin's condition was known among the elite but rarely emphasized in public proclamations. When possible, he appeared as expected, presiding over councils, attending religious ceremonies, receiving envoys. His attendants learned to assist discreetly. Supports were offered without drawing attention. The goal was continuity, not concealment. Baldwin did not pretend to be unaffected, but neither did he allow illness to define his authority. As the disease progressed, physical sensations diminished. This created dangers beyond weakness. Injuries could go unnoticed. Fatigue accumulated silently. Baldwin adapted by limiting exposure to risk. He avoided unnecessary travel, conserved energy, and relied increasingly on trusted officials. These adjustments were practical, not symbolic. They reflected an understanding that leadership could be exercised through judgment rather than presence alone. Medieval kingship emphasized visibility. A ruler was expected to be seen dispensing justice, leading armies, and embodying stability. Baldwin challenged this model by necessity. His kingship was quieter, more administrative, yet no less real. Over time, subjects and nobles adjusted expectations. Authority became associated with decisions rather than appearances. This shift had consequences for court culture. Advisors gained prominence. Written orders replaced spoken commands more often. The king's seal, affixed to documents, carried weight independent of his physical presence. Bureaucratic habits strengthened. What might have seemed a weakness became an institutional adaptation that benefited the kingdom's resilience. Public perception of Baldwin evolved gradually. Early sympathy gave way to respect. Chroniclers noted his persistence and composure. He did not seek pity, nor did he dramatize his condition. This restraint mattered. In a religious society, excessive focus on suffering could invite interpretations of divine disfavor. Baldwin's steady demeanor countered such narratives. He ruled as though illness were a circumstance, not a verdict. Religious institutions responded cautiously. Leprosy was associated with ritual impurity, yet the king's anointing set him apart. Clergy avoided challenging his legitimacy. Instead, they framed his endurance as evidence of responsibility and humility. Baldwin attended services when able, reinforcing the link between crown and church without inviting scrutiny. The psychological burden of illness was significant, though rarely recorded explicitly. Baldwin knew his condition was incurable and progressive. This knowledge influenced his approach to time. Decisions were made with an awareness of limits. Delays were weighed carefully. Succession planning, though politically fraught, remained a constant concern. Baldwin understood that uncertainty after his death could undo years of careful governance. Yet he did not rush recklessly. Illness did not push him toward desperate action. Instead, it fostered caution. Baldwin preferred stability over ambition. He resisted proposals that promised short-term gain at high risk. This conservatism frustrated some nobles, particularly those eager for expansion. Baldwin accepted that frustration as the price of survival. The physical manifestations of leprosy eventually became harder to ignore. Hands weakened, vision suffered, pain and numbness alternated unpredictably. Baldwin adjusted his daily schedule. Councils were shorter, audiences more selective. Still, he maintained involvement. Reports were read aloud, decisions were discussed. Authority flowed through presence of mind rather than physical vigor. Military leadership posed a particular challenge. Kings were expected to lead from the front. Baldwin could not always do so safely. When he did appear on campaign, it was carefully planned. He rode with support, avoiding prolonged exposure. His presence carried symbolic importance, reinforcing morale. When absent, he delegated to experienced commanders, ensuring clear lines of authority. These arrangements required trust. Baldwin cultivated loyalty by consistency. He rewarded service reliably and avoided capricious changes. Nobles learned that his word could be relied upon. In a kingdom where shifting alliances were common, this reliability became a source of strength. Leprosy also influenced diplomatic interactions. Foreign envoys were aware of Baldwin's condition. Some interpreted it as a sign of weakness. Others saw it as irrelevant to policy. Baldwin did not attempt to manage these perceptions directly. He allowed outcomes to speak. Treaties were honored, defenses maintained, the kingdom functioned. Within the broader cultural context, Baldwin's reign subtly challenged assumptions about leadership. Physical wholeness was no longer the sole measure of authority. Competence, judgment, and continuity gained prominence. This was not a philosophical shift articulated in texts, but a practical adaptation observed in practice. Baldwin's illness also humanized the crown. Subjects saw a ruler who endured visible hardship without withdrawal. This did not erase hierarchy, but it softened it. Chroniclers describe a king who accepted assistance without shame, who acknowledged limits without surrendering responsibility. Such descriptions suggest admiration rather than pity. The disease imposed boundaries that Baldwin respected. He did not attempt to outpace his condition. Instead, he structured governance to accommodate it. This required foresight and discipline. Many rulers ignored personal limitations until crisis forced change. Baldwin adapted early, minimizing disruption. As years passed, the progression of leprosy became undeniable. Public appearances decreased, the burden on deputies increased, yet the framework Baldwin had built held. Decisions continued. The court functioned. External threats were managed. Illness did not halt governance, it shaped its form. This period of Baldwin's reign reveals a central truth. Kingship was not undone by physical decline, it was transformed. Authority persisted through adaptation, through institutions strengthened by necessity, and through a ruler who understood that leadership was more than the body that carried it. Leprosy defined Baldwin's limitations, but it did not define his reign. Instead, it compelled a style of rule that valued continuity, consultation, and restraint. These qualities would soon be tested by events beyond the court, as external pressures intensified and the fragile balance Baldwin maintained faced its greatest challenges. Saladin rises in the east. While King Baldwin IV managed the delicate balance of rule within Jerusalem, a parallel transformation was unfolding beyond the kingdom's borders. It did not announce itself with a single invasion or proclamation. Instead, it emerged through consolidation, patience, and a steady reordering of power in the Muslim world. By the mid-1172s, the political environment surrounding Jerusalem had begun to change in ways that would test every assumption on which the Crusader states depended. For decades, the survival of the Latin kingdom had relied on fragmentation among its neighbours. Muslim rulers in Syria and Egypt had often been divided by rivalry, local interests, and competing claims of legitimacy. This division allowed the Crusader states to negotiate separate truces, exploit rivalries, and recover from defeats without facing coordinated pressure. Baldwin had inherited a kingdom accustomed to this pattern, yet even in his earliest years as king, signs suggested that this advantage was eroding. The figure at the centre of this transformation was Saladin. His rise was neither sudden nor inevitable. Born into a Kurdish family serving the Zengid dynasty, Saladin advanced through military and administrative service rather than royal inheritance. His early career unfolded in Egypt, where political instability created opportunity. When he became vizier of Egypt in 1169, few in Jerusalem viewed him as a long-term threat. Egypt had long been weakened by internal strife, and Saladin initially ruled in the name of others. Over time, however, Saladin consolidated authority with deliberate care. He He strengthened the army, reformed administration, and cultivated religious legitimacy. When the Fatimid Caliphate ended in 1171, Saladin aligned Egypt formally with Sunni Islam, gaining support from religious scholars and political leaders. This move did not immediately threaten Jerusalem, but it altered the balance of power. Egypt, once a fragmented neighbour, was becoming a unified and disciplined state. To the north, Saladin extended influence into Syria. His acquisition of Damascus in 1174 marked a turning point. With Egypt and much of Syria under his control, Saladin held resources and manpower unmatched by any single Crusader state. Yet his approach toward Jerusalem remained cautious. He did not rush toward open war. Instead, he secured his position, addressed internal challenges, and observed the Latin kingdom carefully. For Baldwin and his advisors, this evolving situation demanded attention. Reports from the frontier, correspondence from allies, and accounts from merchants all indicated growing coordination among Muslim forces. The familiar pattern of divided opponents was giving way to something more cohesive. Baldwin did not react with panic. His illness had taught him to distinguish between immediate threats and long-term shifts. Saladin represented the latter. The kingdom responded by reinforcing diplomacy. Truces were negotiated, renewed, and carefully observed. These agreements were pragmatic rather than trusting. Both sides understood they were temporary. Baldwin supported such arrangements, recognizing that time was valuable. Each year of peace allowed the kingdom to conserve resources, repair defenses, and manage internal affairs. At the same time, Baldwin did not underestimate the ideological dimension of Saladin's rise. Saladin framed his authority in religious terms, presenting himself as a defender of Islam and a restorer of unity. This rhetoric resonated across the region. While Baldwin avoided dramatic gestures, he understood that Jerusalem's symbolic importance made it a focal point. The city was not merely a strategic objective, it carried religious significance that could mobilize populations. Within the court of Jerusalem, opinions differed. Some nobles advocated preemptive action, arguing that Saladin's consolidation made delay dangerous. Others urged caution, noting the kingdom's limited manpower and Baldwin's declining health. Baldwin listened to both sides. His decisions reflected a preference for measured response. He authorized defensive preparations, but avoided reckless provocation. Saladin's own actions reinforced Baldwin's caution. Rather than launching immediate campaigns against Jerusalem, Saladin tested boundaries. Raids probed defenses. Diplomatic signals were mixed. He negotiated truces even as he strengthened his forces. This approach made it difficult to justify large-scale mobilization without clear cause. Baldwin recognized this ambiguity as intentional. The broader Muslim world also influenced Saladin's strategy. His authority was not unchallenged. Rival claimants, internal dissent, and the need to maintain legitimacy required attention. Saladin balanced external ambition with internal consolidation. Baldwin, observing this, understood that Saladin was unlikely to risk everything on a premature confrontation. Despite this restraint, tension increased steadily. Border incidents became more frequent. Intelligence reports grew more concerning. The sense of impending change permeated the kingdom. Baldwin responded by strengthening castles, maintaining readiness, and reinforcing alliances with neighbouring Crusader states. Coordination among these states had always been uneven, but shared concern about Saladin encouraged cooperation. Baldwin's illness shaped his leadership during this period. He did not lead frequent campaigns, but he remained engaged in strategic planning. He consulted experienced commanders and delegated authority clearly. His presence at key moments reinforced unity. Even when physically limited, his role as king remained central. Saladin's reputation grew alongside his power. Chroniclers on both sides noted his discipline, administrative skill, and ability to inspire loyalty. These qualities contrasted with the factionalism within the Latin kingdom. Baldwin was aware of this contrast. It reinforced his emphasis on internal stability. A divided court, he knew, would be vulnerable to a unified opponent. Diplomatic exchanges between Jerusalem and Saladin reflected mutual calculation. Truces were honoured more often than broken. Both sides benefited from stability. Baldwin used these periods to manage succession issues and court politics. Saladin used them to strengthen his state. Neither believed peace would last indefinitely. The cultural atmosphere of the region reflected this tension. Pilgrims continued to travel. Trade persisted. Daily life in Jerusalem retained a sense of normalcy. Yet beneath this surface, preparations continued. Both sides anticipated eventual conflict without knowing its form or timing. Baldwin's approach during this phase revealed his strengths. He did not seek glory through confrontation. He sought endurance. His illness limited personal ambition, but it sharpened strategic focus. He accepted that Jerusalem's survival depended on careful timing and unity more than bold gestures. As Saladin's power became undeniable, Baldwin's role as stabilizer grew more important. He embodied continuity in a time of change. His calm governance reassured allies and discouraged panic. The kingdom adjusted to a new reality without collapsing into fear. This period did not produce decisive battles or dramatic reversals. Instead, it marked the quiet transition from an era of fragmented opposition to one of organized challenge. Baldwin recognized this shift and adapted. He could not halt Saladin's rise, but he could prepare Jerusalem to face it. The stage was set for encounters that would test both leaders. For Baldwin, the challenge lay not only in confronting a formidable opponent, but in doing so while managing the limits imposed by his own body and the divisions within his realm. The rise of Saladin was not a single event but a gradual tightening of circumstances, and Baldwin's response to it would define the most memorable moments of his reign, the Battle of Montgisard. The confrontation that would later be remembered as the Battle of Montgisard did not begin with grand strategy or confident preparation. It began with uncertainty, misjudgment, and a series of movements that neither side fully expected to converge when and where they did. For King Baldwin IV, the events of late 1177 unfolded at a moment when his authority, his health, and the fragile stability of his kingdom were all under quiet strain. What followed would reshape how he was perceived, not only by his enemies, but by his own court and allies. In the autumn of that year, Saladin launched a campaign that appeared, at first, limited in scope. His forces moved westward from Egypt into the territory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, advancing along the coast. The objective seemed straightforward: test defences, gather intelligence, and demonstrate strength. Saladin had reason to believe resistance would be minimal. Baldwin was young, visibly ill, and the kingdom's main forces were dispersed. Several contingents were engaged elsewhere, guarding borders or fulfilling obligations to allies. Jerusalem itself was lightly defended. Baldwin, aware of the situation, faced a decision that demanded speed rather than deliberation. Waiting for reinforcements risked allowing Saladin to strike deeper into the kingdom. Retreating behind fortified positions might preserve forces but concede initiative. Baldwin chose movement. Despite his illness, he gathered what troops he could, knights, infantry, and members of the military orders, and set out to intercept Saladin before the situation worsened. The army Baldwin assembled was small by any standard. Contemporary estimates vary, but it was vastly outnumbered by Saladin's force. This imbalance was obvious to all involved. Yet the decision to advance was not reckless. Baldwin relied on geography, timing, and the element of surprise. Saladin's troops were spread out, engaged in foraging and raiding. They did not expect a coordinated counterattack from such a limited force. The march itself was difficult. Baldwin's health imposed constraints. He travelled with assistance, conserving energy for what lay ahead. The presence of the king, however limited physically, had a unifying effect. Soldiers knew the risks. They also knew the stakes. The defence of the kingdom and the credibility of its ruler were intertwined. The encounter took place near Montgisard, close to the coastal town of Ramla. Baldwin's forces approached swiftly, capitalizing on Saladin's dispersed formation. The timing was crucial. Saladin's army was not fully assembled for battle, and communication among his units was strained. Baldwin's commanders recognized the opportunity and pressed forward. What followed was not a prolonged engagement but a decisive clash. The smaller Crusader force struck with concentration, targeting key points before Saladin could reorganize. The presence of the king, bearing the relic of the true cross according to tradition, reinforced morale. The symbolism mattered. In a deeply religious society, such symbols carried psychological weight, reinforcing the sense of purpose and resolve. Saladin's forces, surprised and disorganized, struggled to respond effectively. The terrain limited maneuverability. Units found themselves isolated. Baldwin's commanders exploited these conditions, maintaining pressure and preventing recovery. The engagement unfolded rapidly, leaving little room for adjustment. The outcome was unexpected. Saladin's army broke and retreated, suffering significant losses. Saladin himself escaped narrowly, withdrawing with a fraction of his original force. For Jerusalem, the victory was immediate and dramatic. Against considerable odds, Baldwin had repelled one of the most formidable leaders of the region. The aftermath was marked by astonishment as much as celebration. Within the kingdom, Baldwin's reputation transformed. He was no longer merely the sickly king whose reign was tolerated out of necessity. He was a ruler capable of decisive action under pressure. Chroniclers emphasized the contrast between his physical condition and the result achieved. The victory challenged assumptions about weakness and strength. Baldwin did not exploit the victory recklessly. He did not pursue Saladin deep into hostile territory. He understood the limits of his forces and the temporary nature of advantage. Instead, he consolidated gains, secured defenses, and returned to governance. This restraint reinforced his credibility. The victory was framed not as a turning point that guaranteed safety, but as proof that the kingdom could still defend itself. For Saladin, the defeat was instructive rather than debilitating. He acknowledged the setback and adjusted his approach. The loss reinforced the importance of caution and preparation. He did not abandon his broader objectives, but he recognized that Jerusalem under Baldwin could not be dismissed lightly. Diplomatically, Montgisard altered calculations. Allies viewed Jerusalem with renewed respect. Potential aggressors reconsidered assumptions. Truces negotiated afterward reflected mutual acknowledgement of capability. Baldwin used this leverage to stabilize borders and manage internal affairs. Within the court, the victory strengthened Baldwin's position. Factions that had questioned his leadership moderated their stance. His judgment, rather than his health, became the focus. The battle provided political capital that Baldwin used carefully, reinforcing unity without provoking rivalry. The personal toll on Baldwin was significant. Participation in the campaign exhausted him. Recovery was slow, yet he did not regret the decision. He had acted when necessary, accepted risk, and achieved a result that preserved the kingdom's position. The experience confirmed his understanding of leadership. Timing and clarity mattered more than force alone. The Battle of Montgisard entered the memory of the kingdom not as a miracle or legend, but as an example of how preparation, unity, and decisiveness could overcome disadvantage. For Baldwin, it marked the peak of his active military involvement. His health would not permit many such engagements, yet the impression endured. In the years that followed, Montgisard served as a reference point. It shaped how Baldwin negotiated, how his enemies planned, and how his subjects perceived him. It did not end the conflict with Saladin, but it delayed escalation and demonstrated resilience. The significance of Montgisard lay not only in victory, but in what it revealed about Baldwin's reign. He was a king who understood limits and opportunities, who acted decisively when necessary, and who resisted the temptation to overreach. The battle affirmed that illness did not preclude leadership, and that authority could manifest through judgment and timing. As the kingdom settled back into its precarious balance, the memory of Montgisard lingered. It offered reassurance in uncertain times, and set a benchmark against which future decisions would be measured. For Baldwin, it was a defining moment not because it promised lasting security, but because it proved that even under constraint, effective leadership was possible. Fragile peace, tense truces. After Montgisard, the kingdom entered a period that felt quieter on the surface, yet demanded constant attention beneath it. Victory had steadied nerves and reshaped expectations, but it had not altered geography, population, or long-term pressures. For King Baldwin IV, the years that followed were defined less by dramatic clashes than by the careful management of peace. Peace that was provisional, conditional, and always at risk of unraveling. Truces became the primary instrument of survival. They were not expressions of trust nor signs of reconciliation. They were tools, negotiated with precision and observed with caution. Baldwin understood their value. Each truce bought time to repair fortifications, to replenish supplies, to manage succession questions, and to allow his own strength to recover after the strain of campaign. He approached diplomacy with the same restraint that marked his governance, preferring stability over spectacle. The negotiations themselves reflected mutual calculation. Saladin, having learned from Montgisard, avoided overextension. He had no desire to risk another engagement without clear advantage. Baldwin, aware of his limited manpower and declining health, avoided provocations that could invite retaliation. Both leaders recognized that open war would be costly and uncertain. Truces offered predictability in an unpredictable environment. These agreements varied in length and scope. Some covered specific regions or routes, others addressed broader cessation of hostilities. Trade provisions were often included, allowing merchants to move goods across borders. Such clauses mattered. The kingdom's economy depended on commerce as much as defense. Maintaining trade routes ensured supplies and revenue, reinforcing internal stability. The observance of truces required discipline. Raids by independent actors, tribal groups, mercenaries, or overly ambitious nobles could undermine agreements. Baldwin worked to restrain such behavior. He issued orders, enforced penalties, and reminded his court that a single violation could trigger wider conflict. This insistence on control was not always popular. Some nobles viewed restraint as weakness. Baldwin accepted that criticism as the cost of survival. Internally, peace created space for unresolved issues to surface. Succession remained the most sensitive. Baldwin's inability to produce heirs meant that the future of the crown depended on arrangements that would outlast him. Discussions about guardianship, marriage alliances, and regencies continued quietly. Baldwin did not rush these decisions. He observed alliances forming and dissolving, gauging loyalty and competence. Truces provided the breathing room necessary for such deliberation. The court's atmosphere during this period was cautious rather than complacent. Advisors knew that peace was temporary. Military readiness remained high. Castles were maintained. Garrisons rotated. Baldwin supported these measures, recognizing that preparedness deterred opportunism. He avoided public declarations of confidence that might invite challenge. Instead, he allowed routine and readiness to speak for themselves. Baldwin's health continued to decline, though not in a straight line. Periods of relative stability alternated with episodes of weakness. During stronger phases, he resumed more active involvement in council and administration. During weaker periods, he relied on deputies. This rhythm became familiar. The court adapted. Governance continued without abrupt disruption. Diplomatic correspondence increased. Envoys travelled frequently between Jerusalem and neighbouring powers. Baldwin read reports carefully. He understood that information was as valuable as troops. Knowledge of movements, intentions, and internal disputes beyond the borders informed decisions at home. Truces were adjusted in response to shifting conditions. Baldwin treated diplomacy as an ongoing process rather than a series of discrete events. The wider region mirrored this tension. In cities and villages, daily life continued. Pilgrims arrived and departed, markets operated, religious observances followed established calendars. Yet the presence of armed men, the maintenance of fortifications, and the vigilance of patrols reminded all that peace rested on fragile foundations. Baldwin did not seek to disguise this reality. He allowed preparedness to remain visible, reinforcing deterrence. Relations with other Crusader states also required attention. Coordination was uneven. Each state had its own priorities and vulnerabilities. Baldwin worked to maintain alignment where possible, recognizing that division among allies invited exploitation. Shared concerns about Saladin encouraged cooperation, though rivalry never vanished entirely. Baldwin navigated these dynamics with patience, emphasizing common interest over ambition. The role of military orders during this period was particularly significant. Their fortresses anchored defense, and their discipline supported truce enforcement. Baldwin maintained close communication with their leadership, aligning strategies without overstepping authority. He recognized their autonomy and the importance of their international support. Cooperation, not command, defined their relationship. Public perception of Baldwin during these quieter years was shaped by consistency. He did not promise decisive resolution, he promised continuity. Chroniclers described a king who ruled steadily despite physical decline. His restraint contrasted with expectations of dramatic leadership, but earned respect. In a land accustomed to upheaval, predictability had value. The tension underlying peace occasionally surfaced in incidents that tested resolve. Border skirmishes, disputed caravans, and accusations of truce violations demanded response. Baldwin addressed these carefully, seeking clarification before retaliation. He understood that misinterpretation could escalate unnecessarily. His approach emphasized communication and verification. Saladin's posture during this period mirrored Baldwin's caution. He strengthened his state, addressed internal challenges, and maintained diplomatic channels. The absence of major conflict did not signal abandonment of long-term goals. Both leaders prepared quietly, aware that circumstances would eventually shift. Within Jerusalem, the lull allowed Baldwin to focus on institutional strength. Administrative processes were refined, legal disputes were resolved, financial management improved. These tasks lacked drama but mattered profoundly. A kingdom weakened from within could not withstand external pressure. Baldwin invested in governance as a form of defense. As years passed, the balance grew more delicate. Baldwin's declining health increased urgency around succession. Truces bought time, but did not resolve uncertainty. Baldwin faced the challenge of ensuring continuity without provoking division. His decisions during this period would shape events beyond his lifetime. The fragile peace of these years was not an interlude between storms. It was a sustained effort to hold equilibrium in a shifting landscape. Baldwin's role was central. He maintained focus, resisted provocation, and accepted limits. His kingship during this period demonstrated that restraint could be as demanding as action. When the truces eventually frayed, it would not be because they were misunderstood. It would be because circumstances changed. For now, Baldwin used every measure available to preserve stability, knowing that time was both ally and adversary. The peace he maintained was never secure, but it was real, and it sustained the kingdom through years that might otherwise have brought collapse. Family, marriage, and heirs. As the rhythm of truces and cautious diplomacy continued, another set of pressures moved steadily to the center of King Baldwin IV's reign, pressures that could not be delayed indefinitely and could not be resolved by negotiation with foreign powers. These concerns were domestic, deeply personal, and profoundly political. They revolved around family, marriage, and the unavoidable question of succession. For a king who knew his life would be shorter than most, the future of the crown was not an abstract problem. It was a responsibility that pressed closer with every passing year. Baldwin's illness ruled out marriage and children of his own. This reality was understood early, even if it was never stated openly in formal records. In a monarchy where legitimacy rested on bloodlines and continuity, this absence shaped every calculation. The focus shifted naturally to Baldwin's siblings, especially his sister Sibylla, whose marriages would determine the next generation of rulers. What might have been a family matter in quieter times became the central axis of court politics. Sibylla had been raised, like Baldwin, within the expectations of royalty. She was intelligent, accustomed to court life, and fully aware that her personal choices were inseparable from political consequences, yet her position was uniquely difficult. As a woman in a male-dominated political culture, her authority would always be mediated through marriage. Baldwin understood this clearly. Any husband she took would gain influence, potentially rivaling the king himself or shaping the kingdom after his death. The court quickly divided over what kind of marriage would best serve Jerusalem. Some nobles favoured alliances with established families within the kingdom, believing local roots ensured loyalty. Others argued for foreign matches, hoping to secure military or diplomatic support from Europe. Baldwin listened carefully to these arguments. He had seen how regents and powerful nobles could dominate governance. He was determined not to hand the kingdom to an ambitious outsider without safeguards. Sibylla's first marriage, to William of Montferrat, reflected this balancing act. William was a nobleman of respectable lineage, connected to powerful families in Europe, yet not deeply entrenched in Jerusalem's internal factions. The marriage appeared promising, It offered external prestige without immediately destabilizing local politics. Baldwin approved it cautiously, aware that outcomes could not be fully predicted. William's death, shortly after the marriage, altered everything. Sibylla was left a widow, pregnant with a son, Baldwin V. This development introduced both hope and complication. The birth of a male heir offered a solution to the succession problem, but the child's minority meant regency would be inevitable. Baldwin, remembering his own youth under regents, recognized the risks. A child king could unite the kingdom symbolically while exposing it politically. As Baldwin's health declined, the presence of his nephew became increasingly significant. The boy represented continuity without immediate displacement. Baldwin took steps to ensure the child's legitimacy and protection, yet the question of Sibylla's remarriage remained. She could not remain a widow indefinitely without leaving power concentrated in uncertain hands. The court again divided. Some favoured cautious delay, allowing Baldwin to maintain control as long as possible. Others pressed for a second marriage that would strengthen defences and secure leadership. Baldwin weighed these pressures carefully. His decisions during this period reveal both his caution and his awareness of time's constraints. Sibylla's second marriage, to Guy of Lusignan, proved far more controversial. Guy was a relatively new arrival, with limited local support but strong backing from certain factions. Baldwin's approval of this match has been debated by historians, but at the time, it reflected complex considerations. Guy's connections offered potential military support, and his lack of entrenched alliances within Jerusalem could, in theory, make him manageable. Reality proved less accommodating. Guy's temperament and judgment soon raised concerns. Baldwin observed his actions closely, evaluating his suitability not merely as a noble, but as a potential future king. As evidence accumulated, Baldwin's confidence waned. He began to distance Guy from authority, limiting his influence where possible. These decisions strained family relations and court unity. Sibylla remained loyal to her husband, creating tension with Baldwin and his advisors. The king found himself navigating a delicate balance between familial obligation and political responsibility. His illness added urgency. He could not afford prolonged uncertainty, yet decisive action risked alienating powerful supporters. Baldwin responded with measured intervention. He did not immediately remove Guy from consideration, but he curtailed his authority. He promoted other nobles to key positions and reinforced the role of councils. These steps were designed to prevent any single figure from dominating governance prematurely. The presence of Baldwin V complicated matters further. The child became a focal point for factions seeking stability or influence. Baldwin recognized the danger of allowing the boy to become a political pawn. He took steps to establish clear guardianship and succession arrangements, aiming to minimize conflict after his death. Throughout these negotiations, Baldwin's personal conduct remained restrained. He did not dramatize his illness or use it to pressure loyalty. Instead, he appealed to shared interest in the kingdom's survival. His arguments emphasized continuity, preparedness, and the avoidance of internal division. This approach did not eliminate conflict, but it contained it. The broader population observed these developments with concern and uncertainty. Succession disputes were not abstract matters. They affected taxes, military service, and security. Baldwin's visible effort to manage the process reassured many that the crown remained attentive. Even as his health deteriorated, governance did not stall. Church figures also played a role. They advised on legitimacy, guardianship, and moral authority. Baldwin engaged with them pragmatically, ensuring that succession plans aligned with legal and religious norms. This alignment mattered. Disputed legitimacy could invite rebellion or external intervention. As years passed, Baldwin's capacity to manage these issues personally diminished. He delegated more responsibility, yet remained involved in key decisions. His declining strength sharpened focus rather than diffusing it. Each choice carried weight, not only for his reign, but for the kingdom's future. The intertwining of family and politics during this period illustrates the human side of Baldwin's kingship. He was not only a ruler managing abstract institutions, he was a brother, an uncle, and a guardian of a fragile lineage. His illness forced him to confront succession earlier and more intensely than most rulers. The resulting decisions were imperfect, shaped by limited options and competing pressures. By the time Baldwin's health worsened significantly, the framework for succession was largely in place. It was not ideal, and it would be tested severely after his death. Yet it reflected a sincere effort to balance legitimacy, stability, and realism. Baldwin did not seek personal legacy through grand reform. He sought continuity. This chapter of his reign underscores the quiet difficulty of leadership under constraint. Baldwin could not dictate outcomes. He could only shape conditions. Through cautious marriage arrangements, careful limitation of authority, and persistent attention to legitimacy, he did what he could to prepare the kingdom for a future he would not see. The question of heirs never left his mind, nor did it ever resolve cleanly. Yet Baldwin's handling of it reveals his character: deliberate, restrained, and acutely aware that the survival of Jerusalem depended as much on internal cohesion as on external defense. The king as symbol. As years passed, and the practical limits of King Baldwin IV's health became increasingly visible, a subtle transformation took place in how his presence functioned within the kingdom. He had never relied on spectacle or physical dominance, but now his role shifted further, from active administrator and occasional campaign leader into something more abstract, yet no less consequential. Baldwin became a symbol not by design, and not through deliberate cultivation, but through circumstance, endurance, and the quiet consistency of his rule. In medieval political culture, symbols mattered deeply. Authority was not sustained by institutions alone, but by shared belief in legitimacy, continuity, and divine order. Kings embodied these ideas through ritual, lineage, and visibility. Baldwin's illness disrupted the usual imagery of kingship, yet over time it produced a different kind of representation. He came to stand for perseverance under limitation, and for the survival of the kingdom itself amid mounting pressure. This symbolic role did not emerge suddenly. It developed gradually as Baldwin's physical participation in governance diminished. Public appearances became less frequent. When he did appear, his condition was impossible to ignore. Hands weakened, movement slowed, and assistance was evident. Yet these appearances carried weight precisely because they were rare and deliberate. Each one reassured observers that the crown still functioned, that the kingdom had not drifted into leaderless uncertainty. For the population of Jerusalem and its surrounding territories, Baldwin's continued rule provided a sense of stability. The kingdom's history was short and turbulent. Kings had died violently or prematurely. Regents had governed with varying degrees of success. Baldwin's persistence, despite illness, contrasted with this pattern. He did not disappear from governance, nor did he abdicate responsibility. His endurance became a reference point against which change was measured. Within the court, Baldwin's symbolic role influenced behavior. Nobles adjusted their ambitions. Open challenges to authority were rare. Even those dissatisfied with succession arrangements or policy choices hesitated to undermine a king whose legitimacy was unquestioned. Baldwin's illness, paradoxically, discouraged overt rebellion. To oppose him directly risked appearing opportunistic or disloyal, particularly when the kingdom faced external threats. This effect extended to foreign relations. Saladin and other regional leaders were aware of Baldwin's condition, yet they also recognized his authority. Diplomatic correspondence continued to address him formally as king. Truces were negotiated and respected in his name. Baldwin's physical decline did not diminish the legal or symbolic standing of the crown. In some respects, it reinforced it. The image of a king who ruled despite personal suffering aligned with broader medieval ideals of duty and endurance. Religious interpretation played a role in shaping this perception. While leprosy carried stigma, it could also be framed as a trial born with humility. Clergy avoided portraying Baldwin's illness as judgment. Instead, they emphasized his responsibility and restraint. Religious observances in which Baldwin participated underscored the continuity between crown and church. These rituals reassured the faithful that divine order remained intact. Baldwin himself did not exploit this symbolism overtly. He avoided dramatic gestures or public declarations centered on his suffering. His demeanor remained restrained. This restraint was crucial. Had he emphasized his condition, it might have invited pity rather than respect. By treating illness as a fact rather than a narrative, he allowed others to draw their own conclusions. The king's reduced physical presence elevated the importance of formal symbols. Seals, charters, and written orders carried increased significance. Baldwin's seal represented authority even when he was absent. Administrative continuity reinforced the idea that kingship transcended the individual body. The crown endured, even as the king weakened. This shift had lasting effects on governance. Institutions strengthened as reliance on personal leadership diminished. Councils assumed greater responsibility. Delegation became routine. While this was partly necessity, it also fostered resilience. The kingdom learned to function without constant royal intervention. Baldwin's symbolic authority anchored this system, preventing fragmentation. Public memory began to associate Baldwin's reign with steadiness rather than expansion or conquest. Chroniclers emphasized his composure, judgment, and persistence. These accounts shaped how later generations understood his kingship. He was remembered not as a conqueror, but as a ruler who held a fragile realm together under difficult circumstances. The concept of the king as symbol extended to military morale. Even when Baldwin could not lead campaigns, his endorsement mattered. Troops fought in his name. Victories and defeats were attributed to his reign. The presence of his authority, even abstractly, provided cohesion. Soldiers understood they served a legitimate ruler, not a contested regime. Succession debates, though contentious, were moderated by Baldwin's symbolic role. While factions maneuvered, few openly challenged the principle of continuity. Baldwin's careful management of succession arrangements reinforced this. He framed decisions as matters of stability rather than personal preference. This framing drew on his symbolic authority, encouraging acceptance even when agreement was imperfect. The broader population, including non-Latin communities, also responded to this symbolism. Baldwin's tolerance of diverse customs and legal practices contributed to a perception of fairness. His illness did not prompt harsher rule or scapegoating. Daily life continued with relative predictability. This predictability mattered more than ideological alignment. Subjects valued order, and Baldwin provided it. As Baldwin's health deteriorated further, the contrast between physical decline and political continuity became more pronounced. Observers noted that the kingdom did not collapse as his condition worsened. This endurance reinforced the association between Baldwin and stability. He became a reference point. As long as Baldwin lived and ruled, the kingdom held. This symbolic function also influenced how Baldwin approached his own role. Aware of his limitations, he focused on maintaining legitimacy and continuity. He avoided actions that might destabilize governance or provoke division. His restraint was not passivity, it was strategic. He understood that his presence, even diminished, anchored the political order. The transformation of Baldwin into a symbol did not eliminate practical challenges. Governance still required decisions, conflicts still arose. Yet the symbolic dimension of his kingship provided a framework within which these challenges were addressed. Authority did not depend solely on action, it depended on acceptance. In this sense, Baldwin's reign illustrates a broader truth about medieval rule. Kingship was not merely a set of actions performed by an individual, it was a role sustained by belief, ritual, and continuity. Baldwin's illness stripped away some traditional expressions of power, revealing others beneath them. By the later years of his reign, Baldwin was less a participant in daily affairs and more a constant presence in the background, a living reminder of legitimacy. His name carried weight, his approval mattered, his endurance shaped behavior. This symbolic role did not emerge by intention, but it became one of the defining features of his kingship. As the kingdom approached a period of increasing instability, Baldwin's symbolic authority would be tested. Succession loomed, external pressures mounted. Yet even as his strength waned, the meaning attached to his reign persisted. He had become, in effect, the embodiment of a fragile equilibrium. The king, as symbol, was not an abstract concept imposed by chroniclers alone. It was a lived reality, experienced by nobles, soldiers, clergy, and subjects. Baldwin's continued presence, restrained conduct, and unwavering legitimacy created a center of gravity around which the kingdom revolved. This role could not last indefinitely. Symbols, like individuals, are subject to time, but while it endured, it provided coherence in a landscape defined by uncertainty. Baldwin IV did not redefine kingship through theory or proclamation. He did so through endurance, allowing the crown to remain meaningful even as the body that bore it weakened. Internal fractures. As the external pressures on the kingdom remained measured but persistent, a different kind of strain grew within its walls. These were not threats that could be observed from watchtowers or addressed through treaties. They emerged from ambition, uncertainty, and competing visions of leadership. For King Baldwin IV, managing these internal fractures became one of the most demanding aspects of his later reign, not because they were sudden or dramatic, but because they unfolded gradually and resisted easy resolution. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem had always been a coalition rather than a unified state. Its nobility came from different regions of Europe, bringing distinct customs, loyalties, and expectations. Some families had lived in the Levant for generations and developed local ties. Others were recent arrivals, still oriented toward Europe and shaped by crusading ideals rather than long-term settlement. Baldwin inherited this diversity and the tensions it produced. Over time, those tensions deepened. Succession uncertainty lay at the center of these divisions. Baldwin's illness made his eventual death a certainty, even if the timing remained unclear. Every noble understood that power would shift afterward. Positions taken in the present were often shaped by anticipation of the future. Alliances hardened, distrust grew. Baldwin observed these dynamics with concern. He knew that a divided court weakened the kingdom more effectively than any external enemy. One major source of fracture was disagreement over leadership style. Baldwin's restrained, consultative approach suited his circumstances, but it did not satisfy all expectations. Some nobles believed the kingdom required a more aggressive posture, both militarily and politically. They viewed Baldwin's caution as missed opportunity. Others favored stability and diplomacy, aligning more closely with Baldwin's instincts. These differing philosophies influenced responses to nearly every issue, from border incidents to marriage arrangements. The presence of Guy of Lusignan intensified these divisions. As Sibylla's husband and a potential future king, Guy attracted supporters and critics in equal measure. His supporters saw him as a capable military leader who could assert authority decisively. His critics questioned his judgment and temperament. Baldwin's own doubts about Guy were well known within the court, even if not publicly declared. This ambiguity created space for maneuvering. Nobles positioned themselves in relation to Guy, shaping factions that extended beyond the immediate question of succession. Baldwin attempted to manage this by limiting Guy's authority without provoking open confrontation. He reassigned responsibilities, elevated alternative figures, and reinforced the role of councils. These measures slowed the concentration of power, but did not eliminate rivalry. Instead, they redirected it into subtler forms. Influence was sought through appointments, marriages, and control of information rather than overt challenge. The High Court of Jerusalem became a focal point for these struggles. Decisions were debated intensely. Legal arguments were used to justify political positions. Baldwin presided when able, aware that his presence constrained excess. When absent, discussions grew sharper. Advisors competed to shape outcomes. Baldwin's deputies reported back, allowing him to intervene selectively. This system preserved his authority, but demanded constant attention. Religious figures were drawn into these disputes, sometimes intentionally. Appeals to legitimacy, morality, and divine favor were used to support factional claims. Baldwin navigated this carefully. He respected ecclesiastical authority, but resisted allowing it to become a tool for political dominance. His measured engagement with clergy prevented escalation, but did not eliminate underlying tensions. Regional loyalties also contributed to fragmentation. Nobles with holdings near contested borders favored defensive priorities. Those with interests elsewhere pressed different agendas. Baldwin recognized these perspectives as rational rather than disloyal. He sought compromise, aligning resources where possible and rotating responsibilities to avoid entrenched dominance. The military orders, while disciplined, were not immune to internal politics. Their priorities sometimes diverged from those of the crown or the nobility. Baldwin worked to maintain cooperation, emphasizing shared interest in the kingdom's survival. His authority helped mediate disputes, but his declining presence made coordination more challenging. Economic pressures added another layer. Maintaining defenses, supporting garrisons, and sustaining court administration required resources. Disagreements over taxation and expenditure reflected deeper mistrust. Baldwin emphasized fiscal responsibility, aware that financial strain could amplify division. He sought transparency where possible, reinforcing the idea that sacrifice was shared. Public perception of these internal fractures varied. For many subjects, daily life continued with little change. Markets operated, fields were tended, religious observances followed established patterns. Yet rumors circulated. Uncertainty about leadership created unease. Baldwin's continued presence reassured many, but the awareness of his mortality cast a long shadow. Baldwin's health during this period limited his ability to resolve disputes personally. He delegated more frequently, relying on figures he trusted to maintain balance. This delegation was both necessary and risky. Deputies brought their own perspectives and loyalties. Baldwin mitigated this by rotating roles and retaining final approval on critical matters. Still, the system depended heavily on goodwill and restraint. The king's approach to internal fractures was consistent with his broader style. He avoided dramatic intervention. He did not purge rivals or impose rigid control. Instead, he sought equilibrium. This approach preserved stability in the short term, but left underlying issues unresolved. Baldwin was aware of this limitation. His choices reflected a preference for continuity over confrontation. Succession planning intersected with these fractures continually. Baldwin's efforts to secure his nephew Baldwin V as heir were intended to provide a focal point for unity. Yet the child's minority ensured that regency would follow, reopening questions Baldwin had struggled to contain. He recognized this dilemma, but saw no better alternative. Any other arrangement risked immediate conflict. As Baldwin's condition worsened, his symbolic authority became even more important. Factions hesitated to challenge decisions endorsed by the king, even if they disagreed privately. His presence, however limited, constrained ambition. This effect diminished as his appearances became rarer, but it did not vanish entirely. The internal fractures of this period did not result in open civil conflict during Baldwin's lifetime. That outcome was not accidental. It reflected careful management, restraint by key figures, and recognition of shared vulnerability. Baldwin's role in maintaining this balance was central, even when his capacity to act directly was reduced. Yet the cost of this equilibrium was deferred resolution. Tensions accumulated beneath the surface. Baldwin understood that his death would release pressures he had contained. His efforts focused on minimizing damage rather than eliminating conflict. He aimed to hand over a kingdom still functioning, even if fragile. This chapter of Baldwin's reign reveals the limits of leadership under constraint. He could not impose unity by force, nor could he resolve every rivalry. He could only manage conditions, encourage restraint, and maintain legitimacy. His success lay in preventing fragmentation from becoming collapse. Internal fractures are often less visible than external threats, but they can be more destructive. Baldwin confronted them with patience rather than decisiveness, knowing that decisiveness without strength could backfire. His choices reflect a deep understanding of his circumstances and a willingness to accept imperfection in pursuit of survival. As the kingdom moved closer to a transition it could not avoid, these internal divisions remained unresolved. Baldwin's task was not to end them, but to keep them from tearing the kingdom apart while he lived. In this, he succeeded quietly, imperfectly, and at great personal cost. The limits of strength. By the early 1182, the boundaries imposed by illness were no longer gradual or subtle. They had become firm, unavoidable constraints, shaping every aspect of rule. For King Baldwin IV, the challenge was no longer how to govern effectively while ill, but how to govern at all as physical capacity narrowed and dependence increased. The kingdom did not enter this phase suddenly. It slid into it, adjusting step by step as Baldwin's strength ebbed and his authority had to be expressed through fewer, more deliberate acts. Leprosy had progressed beyond its early, manageable stage. Loss of sensation in Baldwin's hands made writing difficult, and at times impossible. His vision deteriorated, forcing him to rely on aids to read documents aloud. Movement became painful and uncertain. Fatigue was constant, not relieved by rest. These changes did not simply reduce comfort, they reshaped the mechanics of governance. Tasks once performed personally now required assistance. Decisions once made swiftly took longer, filtered through layers of communication. Baldwin responded not with withdrawal, but with recalibration. He accepted that his role would be increasingly selective. Instead of overseeing daily administration, he focused on decisions that set direction. He prioritized appointments, succession arrangements, and strategic questions. Routine matters were delegated. This was not abdication, it was triage. Baldwin understood that attempting to maintain full control would exhaust him without improving outcomes. Delegation required trust, and trust carried risk. Baldwin chose deputies carefully, favoring experience and loyalty over ambition. He balanced appointments to prevent any single figure from accumulating unchecked authority. Councils gained prominence. Collective decision-making, though slower, reduced the likelihood of unilateral action. Baldwin's seal remained the final authority, but the process leading to it became more distributed. Public appearances became rare and symbolic. When Baldwin appeared in ceremonies or councils, it was by design rather than habit. These moments reassured observers that the crown still functioned. They also imposed physical cost. Each appearance required preparation and recovery. Baldwin weighed these costs carefully, reserving visibility for moments when it mattered most. Military leadership, already constrained, shifted further toward delegation. Baldwin could no longer travel with armies or remain in the field for extended periods. He appointed commanders and trusted them to execute strategy. Reports were delivered in person or through messengers. Baldwin listened, asked questions, and approved plans, but he no longer directed operations firsthand. This transition was difficult in a culture that valued personal leadership, yet necessity made it unavoidable. The kingdom adapted. Commanders learned to act within defined parameters. Orders were clarified in advance. Contingencies were discussed. The system was imperfect, but it functioned. Baldwin's continued involvement, even from a distance, maintained coherence. His authority anchored the chain of command, preventing fragmentation. Court life adjusted as well. Meetings were shorter, agendas were focused. Baldwin's time and energy were treated as scarce resources. Advisors learned to present information concisely. This discipline improved efficiency. It also altered power dynamics. Those who could communicate clearly and reliably gained influence. Those who relied on rhetoric or presence lost ground. The psychological dimension of this phase was significant, though largely unrecorded. Baldwin was fully aware of his condition's trajectory. He knew that strength would not return. This awareness sharpened priorities. He did not chase unresolved ambitions. He focused on leaving the kingdom intact. His restraint was not resignation. It was acceptance informed by responsibility. Succession planning intensified. Baldwin's nephew, Baldwin IV, was now central to the kingdom's future. The child's position offered continuity but also vulnerability. Baldwin took steps to formalize guardianship arrangements, seeking to limit factional interference. He consulted widely, aiming to secure broad acceptance. These efforts reflected an understanding that clarity, even if imperfect, was preferable to uncertainty. Relations with Guy of Lusignan remained strained. Baldwin's assessment of Guy's leadership capacity did not improve with time, yet removing him entirely risked provoking conflict with Sibylla and her supporters. Baldwin chose containment over confrontation. He limited Guy's authority, reinforced alternative leadership structures, and deferred final resolution. This approach preserved short-term stability at the cost of unresolved tension. Economic management became more challenging as military readiness demanded sustained expenditure. Baldwin emphasized fiscal discipline. He approved necessary spending while resisting extravagant projects. The court's modest tone reflected this priority. Resources were directed toward defense, administration, and essential services. Baldwin understood that economic strain could exacerbate political division. Diplomacy continued. Though Baldwin's personal involvement decreased, trusted envoys represented the crown. Truces were maintained where possible. Baldwin reviewed terms carefully, aware that miscalculation could invite escalation. His illness did not diminish diplomatic caution, it reinforced it. Each agreement was weighed against capacity and risk. Public confidence during this period depended heavily on perception. Baldwin's reduced visibility could have invited doubt, yet the systems he had built mitigated this risk. Governance continued predictably. Justice was administered. Orders were issued. The absence of crisis reassured many. Baldwin's authority remained implicit rather than performative. Religious observance offered continuity. Baldwin participated when possible, reinforcing the connection between crown and church. These moments carried symbolic weight. They reminded subjects that legitimacy endured despite physical decline. Clergy framed Baldwin's perseverance as duty rather than suffering, avoiding narratives that might undermine authority. Internally, the court remained tense but functional. Factions maneuvered cautiously. Open challenges were rare. Baldwin's presence, even diminished, still constrained ambition. His known judgments influenced behavior. Nobles anticipated his response and adjusted accordingly. Authority persisted through expectation as much as action. As Baldwin's strength waned, his patience grew more pronounced. He tolerated delays and imperfections that might earlier have provoked intervention. This tolerance was not indifference. It reflected prioritization. Baldwin focused on preventing catastrophic outcomes rather than perfecting governance. His choices were shaped by realism rather than idealism. The limits of strength forced Baldwin to confront the essence of kingship. Stripped of physical command and constant presence, authority rested on legitimacy, judgment, and continuity. Baldwin embodied these elements quietly. He did not dramatize decline. He adapted to it. Observers later noted that the kingdom did not collapse during this period, despite the king's condition. This resilience was not accidental. It resulted from years of gradual adjustment. Baldwin's willingness to accept limits allowed institutions to mature. His restraint prevented overreach. His clarity preserved direction. This phase of the reign was not marked by triumph or transformation. It was marked by endurance. Baldwin ruled within narrowing boundaries, making choices that reflected awareness of consequence. His leadership did not defy illness, it accommodated it. By accepting the limits of strength, Baldwin preserved what mattered most, the continuity of governance and the legitimacy of the crown. He did not seek to overcome his condition through force of will. He sought to ensure that the kingdom would function despite it. As his capacity continued to decline, the systems he had shaped would face greater strain. The transition ahead would test their durability. Baldwin's role in preparing for that transition, even as his strength faded, would define the final chapters of his reign. Rainald and recklessness. As King Baldwin IV's capacity narrowed and authority flowed increasingly through deputies, the kingdom faced a problem that no illness alone could explain: the disruptive force of individual ambition unchecked by restraint. This problem took its most consequential form in the actions of Rainald of Chatillon, a noble whose temperament, history, and appetite for risk challenged the careful balance Baldwin had spent years maintaining. Rainald's behaviour did not arise in a vacuum, nor did it represent a simple breakdown of discipline. It exposed the limits of Baldwin's system at precisely the moment when those limits mattered most. Rainald was not new to controversy. Long before his arrival in Jerusalem's politics, he had established a reputation for audacity and violence. His earlier career in Antioch had included prolonged imprisonment and confrontations that left lasting impressions on both allies and enemies. When he emerged into prominence again as Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, a territory controlling vital routes east of the Jordan River, he occupied a position of strategic importance. From his fortresses, he could influence trade, pilgrimage, and diplomacy. Baldwin understood the significance of this role and the danger inherent in placing it in volatile hands. Initially, Rainald's position served the kingdom's defensive posture. Ultra-Jourdain guarded approaches from the east and protected routes linking Egypt and Syria. A strong lord there could deter incursions and provide early warning. Baldwin did not appoint Rainald lightly, nor did he underestimate the risks. At the time, Rainald's aggressiveness appeared manageable within the broader framework of truce and preparedness Baldwin favoured. That calculation proved optimistic. Rainald interpreted his authority expansively. He viewed truces not as binding commitments, but as constraints imposed by caution. Where Baldwin sought stability, Rainald sought advantage. His raids extended beyond defensive necessity into provocation. Caravans were attacked, agreements were ignored. These actions did not merely test patience, they undermined credibility. The most alarming aspect of Rainald's conduct was not isolated violence, but pattern. Each raid increased the likelihood of retaliation. Each violation of truce weakened Baldwin's diplomatic position. Baldwin had invested years in cultivating predictability and restraint. Rainald's recklessness threatened to unravel that investment with a single act. Baldwin's response was measured but firm. He issued orders demanding compliance with truces. He summoned Rainald to account for his actions. These interventions reflected Baldwin's understanding of authority: correction before punishment, containment before confrontation. Yet enforcement proved difficult. Baldwin's declining health limited his ability to act swiftly or decisively. Deputies carried messages, councils debated responses. Time passed, and Rainald continued to act. Within the court, opinion divided sharply. Some nobles defended Rainald, arguing that aggression deterred enemies and that truces favoured opponents who used peace to consolidate strength. Others sided with Baldwin, recognizing that unilateral action endangered the entire kingdom. These debates were not abstract, they reflected differing philosophies of survival under pressure. Baldwin recognized the validity of concern about long-term threat, but he rejected Rainald's methods. He understood that provocation without coordination invited disaster. The kingdom lacked the resources to absorb sustained retaliation. Baldwin's illness had sharpened his sensitivity to limits. Rainald's disregard for those limits appeared not courageous, but irresponsible. The challenge lay in enforcement. Removing Rainald outright risked internal conflict. Rainald had supporters, particularly among those who favoured aggressive policy. He also controlled critical territory. Baldwin chose incremental constraint. He reaffirmed truce obligations publicly, narrowing Rainald's room for justification. He increased oversight of border regions. He sought to isolate Rainald politically, rather than confront him militarily. These efforts slowed but did not stop the pattern. Rainald's most provocative actions escalated beyond raids. His interference with pilgrimage routes struck at deeply held religious sensibilities. Such acts transcended political calculation. They carried symbolic weight that Baldwin could not dismiss. They threatened to mobilize opposition far beyond the immediate region. Saladin's response was restrained but attentive. He distinguished between actions authorized by the king and those undertaken independently. Baldwin's efforts to distance the crown from Rainald mattered. Diplomatic channels remained open, yet each incident narrowed space for ambiguity. Patience had limits. Baldwin's illness complicated every response. His capacity to project authority relied increasingly on consensus and legitimacy rather than force. Rainald exploited this indirectly. By acting decisively and violently, he created facts on the ground that Baldwin then had to manage. This inversion of authority was subtle but dangerous. It shifted initiative away from the crown. The court's internal fractures widened under this strain. Supporters of restraint questioned Baldwin's ability to enforce policy. Supporters of aggression grew emboldened. Baldwin navigated these divisions with care. He reiterated principles rather than issuing dramatic decrees. He emphasized shared risk and collective responsibility. His tone remained calm, even as stakes rose. Rainald's recklessness forced Baldwin to confront a hard truth. Systems built on restraint depend on broad compliance. When individuals act outside those norms, enforcement requires strength. Baldwin no longer possessed fully. His response relied on legitimacy and persuasion rather than coercion. This approach preserved unity, but allowed risk to persist. The broader population felt the consequences indirectly. Increased tension affected trade and security. Rumors spread, confidence wavered. Baldwin's steady governance mitigated panic, but uncertainty grew. People understood that a single act could provoke conflict beyond containment. In councils, Baldwin listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words carried weight precisely because they were rare. He reminded nobles that truces were not weakness, but strategy. He emphasized that survival depended on coordination. These reminders did not silence dissent, but they framed debate. Rainald's actions also tested Baldwin personally. They represented a failure of delegation, a reminder that authority dispersed too widely could become uncontrollable. Baldwin did not retreat from responsibility. He adjusted. He sought to strengthen oversight mechanisms and reinforce norms. These adjustments were incremental, reflecting limited capacity. As incidents accumulated, the margin for error narrowed. Baldwin's health declined further. His ability to intervene personally diminished. The kingdom moved closer to a point where restraint might no longer suffice. Rainald's behavior became a catalyst, exposing vulnerabilities Baldwin had worked to contain. This period did not culminate in immediate catastrophe, but it altered trajectories. It hardened attitudes. It reduced trust. It provided justification for future escalation. Baldwin understood this. He worked to mitigate damage rather than reverse it entirely. His choices reflected realism. Perfect control was unattainable. Rainald's recklessness revealed the difference between courage and calculation. Baldwin valued the latter because it preserved options. Rainald pursued the former because it promised immediate assertion. The tension between these approaches defined a critical phase of the reign. For Baldwin, this was not merely a political challenge, but a test of governance philosophy under constraint. He had built a system designed to endure through restraint. Rainald's actions threatened to force decisions that Baldwin's condition made difficult. Managing this threat required patience, diplomacy, and acceptance of imperfection. As the kingdom moved forward, the consequences of this recklessness would echo beyond Baldwin's lifetime. The patterns established here, provocation, retaliation, erosion of trust, would shape later events decisively. Baldwin's efforts to contain them delayed, but did not eliminate their impact. This chapter underscores the vulnerability of fragile systems to individual excess. Baldwin's leadership mitigated damage but could not erase it. His illness limited enforcement, but his judgment remained clear. He recognized the danger and acted within his means. Rainald of Châtillon was not the cause of all future disaster, but his recklessness accelerated instability. Baldwin's response, measured, restrained, and constrained, reflects both the strength and the limits of his kingship in its later years. The shadow of succession. By the time the kingdom entered the final years of King Baldwin IV's reign, succession was no longer a question deferred for later consideration. It had become the central fact around which every political calculation turned. Baldwin's illness had advanced beyond any plausible hope of recovery, and while no one could predict the exact moment of his death, no one doubted that it would come sooner rather than later. The crown, therefore, existed under a shadow, one that shaped loyalties, hardened factions, and demanded decisions that carried consequences well beyond Baldwin's lifetime. Succession in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was never straightforward. The kingdom's short history had already seen regencies, contested claims, and foreign interventions. Unlike older monarchies with entrenched dynasties, Jerusalem relied on a delicate blend of bloodline, legal custom, and acceptance by the High Court. Baldwin understood this better than most. His own accession as a minor had shown him both the necessity and the danger of regency. Now, faced with the prospect of leaving behind a child heir, he confronted the same dilemma from the opposite side. The focus of these concerns was his nephew, Baldwin V, the son of Sibylla and her first husband, William of Montferrat. The boy represented legitimacy in its purest form, a direct male descendant of the royal line. His existence resolved one problem while creating several others. As a minor, he could not rule in his own right. Any reign under his name would require a regent, reopening questions of authority Baldwin had spent years managing. Baldwin's approach to this problem was deliberate and cautious. He did not assume that naming an heir was sufficient. He focused instead on the conditions under which that heir would rule. Who would govern during the minority? How would power be distributed? How could factional conflict be limited? These questions dominated Baldwin's final years of active governance. The central complication remained Sibylla's second husband, Guy of Lusignan. As Baldwin's doubts about Guy's judgment had grown, so too had his concern about the prospect of Guy ruling as king. Yet Sibylla's loyalty to her husband was unwavering. Baldwin could not remove Guy without risking alienation of Sibylla and her supporters, potentially destabilizing the succession he sought to protect. The situation demanded compromise, not clarity. Baldwin's solution was incremental containment. Rather than disinheriting Guy outright, a move that would have provoked immediate conflict, he limited Guy's authority wherever possible. He excluded him from key decisions, elevated alternative figures, and reinforced the role of councils. These measures did not resolve the underlying issue, but they constrained its impact. Baldwin understood that perfection was unattainable. His goal was to prevent catastrophe, not to engineer an ideal outcome. Formal steps towards securing the succession followed. Baldwin arranged for his nephew to be crowned co-king while he was still alive. This act was significant. It established continuity and affirmed legitimacy in unmistakable terms. The boy's coronation signalled to the kingdom and to foreign powers alike that the line of succession was settled, at least in principle. Baldwin hoped this clarity would reduce manoeuvring after his death. Yet even this measure required careful handling. The question of regency remained unresolved. Baldwin consulted widely, seeking a figure or arrangement that could command broad acceptance. Raymond of Tripoli, experienced and respected, emerged again as a potential regent. His prior service during Baldwin's minority recommended him, but his ambition and influence also raised concerns. Baldwin weighed these factors without illusion. Any regent would wield immense power. The challenge was to choose one whose authority would be accepted without provoking resistance. The High Court played a crucial role in these deliberations. Baldwin relied on its authority to legitimize arrangements. He sought consensus rather than decree, understanding that acceptance mattered more than formal correctness. Legal arguments were advanced, precedents cited, and compromises negotiated. The process was slow and contentious, but it reflected Baldwin's preference for institutional stability over personal assertion. Throughout this period, Baldwin's health continued to decline. His ability to attend lengthy councils diminished. He relied on reports, summaries, and trusted intermediaries, yet he remained engaged. Decisions were not delegated entirely. Baldwin understood that succession arrangements made without his oversight would lack legitimacy. His involvement, however limited physically, anchored the process. The broader political environment amplified the stakes. Saladin's power continued to consolidate. While truces remained in effect intermittently, the long-term threat was evident. Baldwin knew that a divided kingdom under weak leadership would invite decisive challenge. Succession was not merely a domestic matter, it was a strategic one. The kingdom's enemies watched closely, assessing vulnerability. Within Jerusalem, reactions to Baldwin's arrangements were mixed. Some nobles welcomed clarity, believing that the co-kingship reduced uncertainty. Others viewed the arrangements as temporary and maneuvered accordingly. Factional alignments shifted subtly. Publicly, loyalty to the crown was affirmed. Privately, calculations continued. Baldwin was not naive about this. He accepted that ambition could not be eliminated, only constrained. The population at large observed these developments with apprehension. Succession crises in the past had brought instability and violence. Baldwin's visible effort to manage the transition reassured many. Even as his appearances grew rarer, his involvement in these decisions signalled responsibility. The king was not abandoning the kingdom to chance. Religious authorities lent support to the process. They affirmed the legitimacy of the young Baldwin V and the necessity of regency. Their endorsement mattered. It framed the succession as lawful and divinely sanctioned, discouraging overt challenge. Baldwin cultivated this support carefully, recognizing its stabilizing effect. Despite these efforts, unresolved tensions persisted. Guy of Lusignan remained a central concern. Baldwin's containment strategy relied on the assumption that institutional arrangements would outlast personal ambition. This assumption was pragmatic but risky. Baldwin understood the risk. He accepted it because alternatives were worse. As Baldwin's strength faded further, the urgency of finalizing arrangements increased. He formalized guardianship for his nephew, clarified lines of authority, and reiterated expectations of loyalty. These acts did not resolve every dispute, but they narrowed the range of uncertainty. Baldwin aimed to leave behind a framework within which conflict could be managed rather than explode uncontrollably. The emotional dimension of this period is difficult to reconstruct, yet its outline is clear. Baldwin faced the knowledge that he would not see the outcome of his decisions. He acted not for personal legacy, but for institutional survival. His restraint, shaped by illness, translated into careful planning rather than dramatic intervention. The shadow of succession loomed over every decision. Baldwin did not attempt to dispel it through force or charisma. He addressed it through law, consultation, and symbolic acts. The co-kingship, the regency arrangements, and the involvement of the High Court reflected this approach. They were tools designed to distribute authority in a way that preserved legitimacy. Whether these measures would succeed was uncertain even as they were enacted. Baldwin knew this, yet he also knew that inaction would guarantee failure. His final years were marked by this realism. He did not promise stability. He worked toward it within limits. The succession Baldwin shaped was fragile, but it was not careless. It reflected years of observation, experience under regency, and understanding of his kingdom's vulnerabilities. The shadow under which he worked was long and inescapable, but it sharpened rather than paralyzed his judgment. As Baldwin's reign approached its end, the structures he put in place would soon be tested by events beyond his control. The effectiveness of those structures would determine the fate of the kingdom he had held together through restraint and endurance. For Baldwin, the task was complete when clarity had been given its best chance. A king withdrawing. The final phase of King Baldwin IV's reign did not announce itself with a declaration or a sudden collapse. It unfolded quietly, marked by absence rather than action, by delegation rather than command. Withdrawal, in this sense, did not mean abdication or surrender. It meant the gradual narrowing of what the king could do in person, and the corresponding expansion of what he had already prepared others to do in his stead. The kingdom did not pause during this transition. It continued, guided by habits and structures Baldwin had shaped precisely for such a moment. By now, Baldwin's illness had progressed to the point where sustained participation in governance was physically impossible. Movement required constant assistance. Pain and numbness alternated unpredictably. Vision deteriorated further. The effort required to appear publicly or attend extended councils was significant, and recovery took days rather than hours. Baldwin accepted these limits without complaint. He did not frame withdrawal as tragedy. He treated it as an adjustment, one more constraint to be managed responsibly. The court adapted. Access to the king became more controlled. Audiences were fewer and more focused. Messages were screened, summarized, and prioritized. Baldwin relied heavily on a small circle of trusted attendants and advisors who understood his preferences and limits. They did not act independently. They acted as conduits. Authority still flowed from the king, but it flowed through narrower channels. This concentration of access carried risks. Influence could be magnified. Miscommunication could have consequences. Baldwin mitigated these risks through redundancy. He requested reports from multiple sources. He encouraged advisors to consult broadly before presenting recommendations. He asked questions designed to reveal assumptions and omissions. Even as his physical presence receded, his intellectual engagement remained sharp. Public life in Jerusalem adjusted to Baldwin's absence. Ceremonies proceeded without him when necessary, presided over by deputies or clergy. Legal judgments continued to be issued in his name. Charters bore his seal. The population grew accustomed to a king who ruled from within, rather than from the center of public view. This adjustment was eased by familiarity. Baldwin's reduced visibility had been gradual. There was no sudden vacuum. The symbolic dimension of his presence persisted. The knowledge that Baldwin still lived and reigned, however privately, shaped behavior. Nobles hesitated to act decisively in ways that might be perceived as overreach. Factions continued to maneuver, but within limits. Baldwin's existence, even in withdrawal, constrained ambition. Succession arrangements moved from planning to implementation. Baldwin's nephew, Baldwin IV, was now formally recognized as co-king. Guardianship structures were activated. Raymond of Tripoli assumed regency responsibilities. These transitions were not seamless, but they were orderly. Baldwin oversaw them as much as he could, approving decisions and correcting course when necessary. Guy of Lusignan's position remained unresolved. Baldwin's earlier efforts to limit his authority now bore mixed results. Guy retained influence through Sibylla and her supporters, but his direct control was curtailed. Baldwin did not attempt a final reckoning. His withdrawal reduced the possibility of dramatic intervention. Instead, he relied on the institutional framework to contain potential disruption. Diplomacy continued largely unchanged. Truces remained in effect where possible. Envoys negotiated with regents and councils, always acknowledging the king's authority. Baldwin reviewed agreements when able, lending legitimacy to decisions made in his absence. His illness did not halt foreign relations, it altered their form. Military readiness was maintained through established routines. Commanders reported to regents and councils. Baldwin was briefed selectively. He approved strategic priorities without directing operations. This distance was not ideal, but it reflected reality. The systems he had encouraged now carried greater responsibility. Within the court, the tone shifted subtly. Urgency increased. Advisors knew that Baldwin's withdrawal was permanent. Discussions about the future grew more pointed, yet restraint persisted. Open conflict remained unlikely while Baldwin lived. His presence, however private, continued to anchor legitimacy. The personal dimension of this withdrawal is difficult to reconstruct, but its outlines are clear. Baldwin did not seek seclusion for comfort. He remained engaged as long as he could. When he withdrew, it was because continued participation risked undermining governance rather than supporting it. He understood that leadership sometimes required stepping back to allow structures to function. Religious observance remained one of the few public arenas in which Baldwin appeared occasionally. These appearances were brief and carefully managed. They reinforced continuity between crown and church. They also reassured the faithful that the king remained mindful of spiritual obligations. Clergy framed Baldwin's withdrawal as humility and responsibility, not decline. Daily life in Jerusalem continued with relative normalcy. Markets functioned, pilgrims arrived, courts convened. The absence of visible crisis reassured many. Baldwin's gradual withdrawal had been anticipated. The kingdom had adjusted incrementally. Behind this stability lay tension. Everyone understood that Baldwin's death would change everything. Withdrawal made that future feel closer, yet Baldwin's careful management reduced panic. He did not leave matters unresolved out of neglect. He left them unresolved because resolution was impossible. His goal was to limit the damage when transition came. The concept of kingship during this phase was almost entirely institutional. Baldwin's authority was expressed through documents, appointments, and expectations rather than presence. This shift tested the resilience of the kingdom's structures. Thus far, they held. Baldwin's own understanding of this moment was shaped by realism. He did not imagine that his preparations guaranteed success. He knew that personalities and circumstances beyond his control would shape outcomes. His responsibility was to provide the best possible framework. He focused on that task until he no longer could. As withdrawal deepened, communication slowed. Decisions took longer. Baldwin's energy was rationed carefully. Advisors learned to distinguish between matters requiring his approval and those that did not. This triage was essential. It preserved what remained of his strength for issues that truly mattered. The court's respect for Baldwin did not diminish with his absence. If anything, it increased. His restraint reinforced the perception that he placed the kingdom above personal authority. This perception mattered. It influenced behavior in subtle ways, discouraging overt defiance. In this phase, Baldwin's kingship reached its most abstract form. He was no longer a visible ruler, nor an active commander. He was the source of legitimacy, the guarantor of continuity. His illness had stripped away all else. What remained was authority rooted in acceptance. This withdrawal was not defeat. It was the final adaptation of a reign shaped by constraint. Baldwin had governed by adjusting to limits from the beginning. Withdrawal was the last adjustment. It allowed the kingdom to function without forcing the king to perform roles he could no longer sustain. As the end approached, Baldwin's focus narrowed further. He confirmed arrangements, reaffirmed expectations, and then allowed others to act. The kingdom moved forward under the weight of transition, steadied by habits formed over years. The king withdrawing did not abandon the realm. He entrusted it to the structures he had shaped, accepting that his role was complete. What followed would test those structures in ways Baldwin could not control. Yet his withdrawal ensured that when the moment came, the kingdom would face it not in chaos, but in continuity. Death of the Leper King. The end of King Baldwin IV's life did not arrive as a dramatic rupture, nor did it disrupt the kingdom in the instant it occurred. By the time death came, the court, the clergy, and the nobility had already been living in its presence for years. Baldwin's illness had long made the outcome inevitable. What mattered now was not surprise, but transition, how a kingdom shaped by restraint and preparation would respond when the figure at its centre finally disappeared. Baldwin's final months were marked by near total withdrawal from public life. Physical suffering was constant. The loss of sensation that had once seemed manageable had advanced into systemic failure. His limbs were largely immobile. Vision was severely impaired. Speech, while still possible, required effort and concentration. Every interaction carried a physical cost. Baldwin conserved what remained of his strength, not out of fear or despair, but because he understood that the value of his authority lay in clarity, not endurance. The court adjusted to this reality with quiet efficiency. Messages were filtered. Decisions requiring the king's approval were presented succinctly. Baldwin listened, responded when necessary, and confirmed arrangements already set in motion. There were no sweeping reforms, no final pronouncements. The work of kingship at this stage consisted of affirmation rather than innovation. Religious care became more prominent, though it did not replace governance. Clergy attended Baldwin regularly, offering rites consistent with his faith and station. These rituals were not public spectacles. They took place privately, reinforcing the sense that Baldwin's death, when it came, would be personal rather than theatrical. The king did not present himself as a martyr or a symbol of suffering. He remained, as he had throughout his reign, restrained and pragmatic. Succession arrangements were reaffirmed repeatedly. Baldwin ensured that there was no ambiguity regarding the status of his nephew, Baldwin V, or the authority of the regency. Documents were reviewed. Witnesses were present. The High Court's role was emphasized. Baldwin understood that legitimacy required process as much as intent. He took care to leave behind records that would support continuity rather than invite dispute. The presence of Guy of Lusignan remained a concern, but Baldwin's capacity to address it directly was gone. He did not attempt a final confrontation. Instead, he relied on the institutional framework he had built to contain potential disruption. This choice reflected acceptance rather than optimism. Baldwin knew that some conflicts could only be managed, not resolved. As Baldwin's condition worsened, communication slowed further. Days passed without formal councils. Advisors consulted among themselves, acting within established parameters. Baldwin's seal continued to authorize decisions, but its use became rarer. The kingdom functioned increasingly on precedent and expectation, rather than direct command. When death finally came, it did not produce immediate upheaval. Baldwin died in Jerusalem in 1185, still young by any standard. The exact circumstances of his final hours were not widely recorded, in part because they were not public events. The king passed quietly, attended by those closest to him. There were no last-minute reversals or dramatic gestures. The end was consistent with the life that preceded it. The announcement of Baldwin's death was received with solemnity rather than shock. The court had anticipated it. Preparations had been made. Rituals were observed. The transition to the next phase of rule began without delay. Baldwin V was recognized as king. The regency arrangements took effect. Authority shifted as planned, at least on paper. Public response reflected a mix of grief and uncertainty. Baldwin had ruled for over a decade under extraordinary circumstances. Many had grown accustomed to his steady presence, even in absence. His death marked the end of a familiar anchor. Yet there was also relief that transition had occurred without crisis. The absence of immediate disorder testified to the effectiveness of Baldwin's preparations. Chroniclers who recorded Baldwin's death emphasized his endurance rather than his suffering. They noted the contrast between his physical condition and the stability of his reign. There was little embellishment. Baldwin was not transformed into legend at the moment of death. He was remembered as a king who had ruled responsibly under constraint. Within the court, reactions varied. Those aligned with Baldwin's cautious approach expressed concern about the future. Those who favored more aggressive leadership viewed the transition as an opportunity. These differences did not erupt immediately. Baldwin's death created space for ambition, but it did not compel instant action. The structures he left behind imposed a temporary discipline. The regency under Raymond of Tripoli began promptly. Raymond's experience provided continuity, but it also reintroduced familiar tensions. Baldwin had trusted Raymond's competence while remaining aware of his ambition. Now, with Baldwin gone, those balances shifted. Authority became more concentrated. The regency would soon face challenges Baldwin had worked to delay. For Baldwin V, the transition was symbolic rather than practical. The child king could not understand the weight of what had occurred. His presence offered legitimacy, not leadership. Baldwin IV had understood this clearly. His death transferred responsibility to adults whose interests did not always align. Externally, Baldwin's death did not go unnoticed. Saladin and other regional leaders were informed promptly. Diplomatic correspondence acknowledged the transition. Truces were observed cautiously. No immediate offensive followed. Saladin understood that a kingdom in transition was vulnerable, but he also recognized the value of patience. Baldwin's death did not instantly alter the strategic balance, but it removed a figure who had consistently favored restraint. The military orders responded with discipline. They affirmed loyalty to the crown and cooperated with the regency. Their leaders understood the importance of stability. Baldwin's relationship with them had been pragmatic and respectful. That foundation eased the transition. For the broader population, Baldwin's death marked the end of a period characterized by predictability despite hardship. Markets continued, courts functioned, life did not halt, yet uncertainty increased. People understood that the king who had held competing interests in check was gone. The future felt less defined. The absence of Baldwin's personal authority became more apparent over time. Decisions that had once been delayed or moderated now advanced more quickly. Factions tested boundaries. The regency, though competent, lacked Baldwin's symbolic weight. Authority now depended more on enforcement than acceptance. Religious interpretation of Baldwin's death remained restrained. Clergy emphasized duty fulfilled rather than suffering endured. Baldwin was remembered as a king who bore illness without abandoning responsibility. This framing reinforced legitimacy during transition, discouraging narratives that might undermine confidence. The death of Baldwin IV did not immediately precipitate disaster. That fact is significant. It demonstrates that his preparations were effective in the short term. He had not ruled in vain. The kingdom did not collapse at the moment of his passing. It continued, governed by the structures he had shaped. Yet the limits of those structures were already visible. Baldwin had contained conflict rather than resolving it. With his death, containment weakened. The regency would soon face pressures Baldwin had absorbed. Succession arrangements would be tested by ambition and circumstance. Baldwin's death also altered memory. As time passed, accounts of his reign began to emphasize certain aspects over others. Some remembered his victories, others remembered his illness. Few fully captured the quiet labor of governance that defined his rule. Yet, among those who had served him, there was recognition that his steadiness had mattered. The Leper King did not die in battle or triumph. He died as he had lived, constrained, deliberate, and attentive to responsibility. His death was not the end of a story, but a turning point. The kingdom he left behind would soon face challenges he had worked tirelessly to postpone. In evaluating Baldwin's death, it is tempting to focus on what followed rather than what ended. Yet it is important to pause. Baldwin's reign represented a sustained effort to govern under conditions that would have overwhelmed many rulers. His death closed that chapter. The absence of immediate chaos stands as testament to his success. The transition after Baldwin's death was not flawless, but it was orderly. That order was his final achievement. He did not live to see the consequences of his arrangements, but he ensured that those consequences would not unfold instantly or uncontrollably. The death of the Leper king marked the end of restraint as the dominant mode of leadership in Jerusalem. What followed would be shaped by different temperaments and priorities. Baldwin's role had been to hold the kingdom together long enough for transition to occur. In that task, he succeeded. His death did not bring peace or resolution. It brought change, and that change would test everything Baldwin had built. But for a brief moment, the kingdom stood intact, guided by habits of governance forged under his quiet, disciplined rule. A kingdom without him. The absence of King Baldwin IV was felt long before its consequences were fully understood. In the days immediately following his death, the machinery of governance moved forward with practiced calm. Rituals were observed, proclamations issued, and authority transferred according to the arrangements Baldwin had shaped. On the surface, the kingdom appeared to continue without interruption, yet beneath this continuity lay a subtle but decisive shift. The restraining presence that had moderated ambition, delayed conflict, and balanced competing forces was gone. What followed was not chaos at once, but a gradual unbinding. The transition centered on the accession of Baldwin V, a child whose legitimacy was unquestioned and whose capacity to rule was necessarily symbolic. The regency, assumed by Raymond of Tripoli, brought experience and authority, but it also reintroduced dynamics Baldwin had carefully contained. Raymond's competence was not in doubt. His position, however, was inherently temporary, and everyone understood that regency was a bridge rather than a destination. Power now rested on enforcement and negotiation rather than acceptance shaped by long familiarity. In the early months, Baldwin's arrangements proved effective. The High Court functioned, councils convened, military readiness was maintained, truces were acknowledged. The military orders affirmed loyalty. This initial stability reflected years of preparation. Baldwin had not left a vacuum, he had left a framework. Yet frameworks depend on the conduct of those who inhabit them, and conduct began to change as the memory of Baldwin's authority receded. Factional calculations resumed with greater openness. Without Baldwin's personal legitimacy to temper ambition, disagreements sharpened. Positions that had once been expressed cautiously were now advanced more directly. Alliances hardened. The question of who would ultimately rule, once the regency ended, moved from background concern to active contest. The presence of a child king intensified this dynamic, rather than resolving it. Raymond of Tripoli approached the regency with restraint. He understood the kingdom's vulnerabilities and the dangers of provocation. He maintained existing policies where possible, honouring truces and emphasising defence. His experience lent credibility, yet his authority lacked the symbolic weight Baldwin had carried. Decisions that Baldwin could have deferred or moderated now required firmer enforcement. Each act of enforcement risked resistance. The position of Guy of Lusignan remained unresolved and increasingly contentious. Baldwin's containment strategy had depended on his own authority. With that authority gone, Guy's supporters pressed more aggressively for influence. Sibylla's loyalty to her husband remained unwavering, and her position as the child king's mother gave her leverage. The regency could delay confrontation, but it could not eliminate it. The court's tone shifted, meetings grew more argumentative, legal interpretations were contested, appeals to precedent multiplied. Baldwin had relied on shared acceptance of his judgment to resolve ambiguity. In his absence, ambiguity invited contest. The High Court became an arena for rivalry rather than mediation. Decisions took longer, and their acceptance was less assured. The broader population perceived these changes indirectly. Daily life continued, but confidence wavered. Baldwin's reign had been associated with predictability despite hardship. His death removed a familiar constant. Rumours circulated, merchants adjusted routes cautiously. Local leaders watched the court more closely, gauging stability. Externally, the kingdom's vulnerability became more apparent. Saladin observed developments carefully. He did not rush to exploit the transition. Patience had served him well before, and it continued to do so. He maintained diplomatic channels, renewed truces selectively, and assessed the kingdom's cohesion. Baldwin's death removed a ruler known for restraint. Whether his successors would maintain that restraint was uncertain. The military orders continued to play a stabilizing role. Their discipline and resources provided continuity, yet even they adjusted posture, preparing for the possibility that diplomacy might fail. Their leaders understood that the kingdom's internal divisions could invite external challenge. The regency faced the difficult task of preserving unity without Baldwin's symbolic authority. Raymond attempted to rely on institutional legitimacy, emphasizing law and precedent. This approach had merit but lacked the emotional resonance Baldwin's endurance had created. Authority now had to be asserted more visibly. That visibility risked backlash. As months passed, Baldwin's absence altered the pace of decision-making. Proposals Baldwin would have delayed were now advanced. Debates Baldwin would have moderated were now allowed to escalate. The regency worked to contain these trends, but containment required energy and enforcement Baldwin's system had previously minimized. Succession loomed ever larger. Baldwin V's health was delicate, and his youth ensured prolonged regency if he survived. This uncertainty intensified competition. Some nobles favored waiting, hoping time would clarify outcomes. Others sought to shape events proactively. Baldwin's careful balance between action and delay was no longer available as a guide. Economic pressures compounded instability. Military readiness demanded resources. Trade fluctuated with uncertainty. Decisions about taxation and expenditure became contentious. Baldwin's emphasis on fiscal discipline had been broadly accepted. In his absence, disagreements over priorities resurfaced. The regency also faced challenges in maintaining consistent policy toward Rainald of Châtillon's legacy of provocation. While Rainald himself remained a destabilizing figure, Baldwin had been the primary counterweight to his excesses. Without Baldwin, enforcing restraint required stronger measures. Each such measure risked inflaming factional loyalty. The cumulative effect of these changes was subtle but real. The kingdom did not collapse, but its margins narrowed. Decisions carried greater risk. Errors were less easily absorbed. Baldwin's long practice of buying time had preserved options. Those options were now being consumed. Clerical support continued to lend legitimacy to the regency, but even religious authority could not replace Baldwin's unique position. Sermons emphasized unity and duty. Rituals affirmed continuity. Yet the lived reality of governance depended on negotiation and power. As the months turned into years, Baldwin's absence became a structural fact rather than an emotional one. New habits formed. Authority was exercised differently. The memory of Baldwin's restraint faded, replaced by new expectations shaped by new leaders. The kingdom without him was not leaderless, but it was unmoored from the particular equilibrium he had maintained. His reign had been defined by managing limits his own and the kingdom's. Without him, limits were tested more aggressively. This period reveals the measure of Baldwin's impact. Stability did not vanish at his death, but its source changed. What had once depended on acceptance now depended on enforcement. That shift increased strain and reduced flexibility. The regency did its best within these conditions. It preserved order, honoured arrangements, and delayed escalation. Yet the sense of inevitability grew. Baldwin had postponed confrontation by years. Those years had allowed the kingdom to function. Now the deferred consequences approached. A kingdom without Baldwin was not immediately weaker in resources or fortifications. It was weaker in cohesion. The quiet authority that had reconciled competing interests was gone. What remained was law, force, and ambition. This phase did not yet bring decisive collapse. It brought exposure. Baldwin's absence revealed how much his presence had mattered. His reign had not solved the kingdom's problems, it had managed them. Without him, management became harder. As the kingdom moved forward, the frameworks Baldwin left behind were tested under pressure. Their durability would determine how long the kingdom could endure. The answer would not be long in coming. Saladin's opening. With the restraining influence of King Baldwin IV gone, the political landscape surrounding the Kingdom of Jerusalem shifted in ways that were gradual at first, then increasingly decisive. What had once been a complex balance of caution, diplomacy, and delayed confrontation began to tilt. This was not because the kingdom suddenly weakened in arms or resources, but because the rhythm of decision-making changed. The opening that followed was not created in a single moment. It emerged through accumulation of misjudgments, impatience, and opportunities recognized by a leader who had been waiting. That leader was Saladin. For years, he had observed Baldwin's kingdom with care. He had learned to distinguish between policy driven by necessity and actions born of provocation. Baldwin's preference for restraint had allowed Saladin to consolidate power without immediate escalation. Now, with Baldwin gone, Saladin reassessed the situation. The question was not whether the kingdom would fracture, but how quickly and in what manner. Saladin did not act impulsively. His strength lay in patience and preparation. He understood that a premature strike could unite a divided kingdom temporarily. Instead, he watched. He gauged the effectiveness of the regency. He noted the persistence of internal divisions, particularly around succession. He monitored the actions of figures whose recklessness had previously threatened truces. Each observation informed timing. The regency under Raymond of Tripoli maintained diplomatic channels, and Saladin responded in kind. Truces were renewed selectively. Envoys exchanged assurances. This surface stability served Saladin's interests. It allowed him to continue strengthening his forces, refining logistics, and consolidating loyalty across Egypt and Syria. He had already unified much of the region under his authority. Now he ensured that unity translated into readiness. Within Jerusalem, the limits of Baldwin's arrangements became more apparent. The child king, Baldwin V, was increasingly frail. His health, always delicate, became a source of anxiety. Regency extended not by design but by necessity. Each extension prolonged uncertainty. Factions adjusted strategies accordingly. Some sought delay, hoping to avoid confrontation. Others pressed for decisive leadership, believing delay favoured Saladin. The death of Baldwin V in 1186 removed the final layer of continuity Baldwin IV had constructed. With the child king gone, succession passed to Sibylla and her husband, Guy of Lusignan. This transition marked a fundamental shift. Authority moved from regency to kingship, but not to a figure with Baldwin's restraint or legitimacy. Guy's accession was contested in sentiment, if not in form. The court accepted it because alternatives were limited, not because consensus existed. Saladin recognized this moment as decisive. The kingdom now faced leadership more inclined toward assertion than caution. Guy's authority depended on demonstrating strength. Baldwin IV had relied on acceptance and restraint. Guy relied on action to establish credibility. This difference mattered. It altered how the kingdom responded to provocation. Rainald of Châtillon's continued provocations became a catalyst. Under Baldwin IV, Rainald's actions had been contained diplomatically. Under Guy, containment weakened. Raids resumed. Truces were violated openly. These acts provided Saladin with justification. He framed his response not as aggression, but as enforcement of order and protection of routes and pilgrims. This framing mattered. It mobilized support across the region and legitimized escalation. Saladin's preparations were thorough. He assembled forces from multiple regions, coordinated logistics, and secured supply lines. His army represented not just numbers, but cohesion. Years of consolidation had produced a disciplined force capable of sustained campaign. In contrast, the Kingdom of Jerusalem struggled to mobilize unity. Internal disagreements delayed response. Strategic clarity was lacking. When conflict resumed openly, it did so under conditions favorable to Saladin. He chose timing and terrain carefully. He avoided unnecessary risk. He exploited the kingdom's need to respond decisively under new leadership. Each movement tested the coherence of Jerusalem's command structure. The difference between Baldwin's era and the present became stark. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 exemplified this shift. While Baldwin IV had avoided decisive engagements under unfavourable conditions, Guy's leadership led the kingdom into a confrontation shaped by urgency rather than calculation. The result was catastrophic. The kingdom's field army was destroyed. Key leaders were captured or killed. Rainald met his end, a personal act by Saladin that underscored the consequences of provocation. The fall of Jerusalem followed. Saladin advanced methodically, taking cities and fortresses with minimal resistance. The kingdom Baldwin IV had held together through restraint collapsed with alarming speed. This collapse was not solely the result of military defeat. It reflected the erosion of cohesion Baldwin had managed for years. Saladin's entry into Jerusalem was marked by discipline rather than destruction. He allowed orderly surrender and protected civilians. This conduct contrasted with earlier conquests and reinforced his legitimacy. It also highlighted the difference between the leadership styles that had shaped the preceding decades. Baldwin's restraint had delayed this outcome. Guy's assertiveness accelerated it. In assessing Saladin's opening, it is important to recognize continuity as well as change. Saladin did not defeat Baldwin IV. He outlasted him. Baldwin's reign had postponed confrontation until circumstances favored Saladin decisively. The opening Saladin exploited was not created by a single error, but by the absence of the one figure who had consistently moderated risk. Baldwin's legacy is visible here by contrast. His careful management of truces, containment of provocation, and emphasis on cohesion had preserved the kingdom longer than many expected. Once those elements were removed, the kingdom's vulnerabilities were exposed rapidly. Saladin's success lay in recognizing this and acting accordingly. This phase underscores the difference between survival and security. Baldwin IV had achieved survival under extraordinary constraints. He had not achieved security because security was unattainable given resources and geography. Saladin understood this distinction. He waited until survival mechanisms weakened, then acted to impose a new order. The opening Saladin exploited was as much political as military. The loss of Baldwin's symbolic authority undermined acceptance of restraint. Leadership that depended on action rather than consensus created conditions Saladin could manipulate. Provocation replaced calculation. Timing replaced patience. The consequences were decisive and lasting. The fall of Jerusalem reshaped the crusading movement and the region's history. Yet this outcome should not obscure the years that preceded it. Baldwin IV's reign delayed this opening, buying time and preserving a fragile balance longer than circumstances suggested possible. Saladin's opening was not inevitable at the moment Baldwin ascended the throne. It became inevitable only when restraint gave way to assertion without unity. Baldwin's illness did not cause this shift. His absence did. This chapter closes the story of transition from endurance to collapse. It illustrates how leadership styles shape outcomes not only through action, but through what they prevent. Baldwin IV prevented premature catastrophe. Saladin exploited the moment when prevention ended. The opening Saladin seized was real, but it was earned through patience and preparation. It was enabled by changes within the kingdom as much as by external strength. Understanding this interplay clarifies Baldwin's significance. He was not defeated, he was succeeded by circumstances he had long delayed. As the dust settled after Jerusalem's fall, the memory of Baldwin IV's reign acquired new clarity. His restraint appeared not as weakness, but as strategy. His illness appeared not as defining failure, but as context within which he achieved more than expected. The opening Saladin closed a chapter that Baldwin had held open through careful governance. It marked the end of the kingdom Baldwin knew, but it also affirmed the importance of his reign. Without Baldwin, collapse came swiftly. With him, it had been postponed. That postponement remains Baldwin IV's enduring contribution to history, legacy of a frail king. When the dust settled after the loss of Jerusalem and the rapid unravelling of the Latin kingdom, the reign of King Baldwin IV began to take on a clearer shape in historical memory. During his lifetime, Baldwin had been judged cautiously, often through the lens of his illness and the constraints it imposed. After his death, and especially after the kingdom's collapse, those same constraints became the key to understanding what he had achieved. His legacy did not lie in conquest, expansion, or lasting institutions. It lay in delay, restraint, and the preservation of coherence under conditions that made coherence exceptionally difficult. Baldwin IV inherited a kingdom already living on the edge of viability. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was small, exposed, demographically thin, and dependent on diplomacy as much as military force. Its survival rested on exploiting divisions among stronger neighbours and maintaining internal unity despite deep cultural and political differences. Baldwin's illness removed from him the most conventional tools of medieval kingship: physical presence, constant visibility, and prolonged leadership in the field. What remained was judgment. His reign demonstrates how far judgment alone could go. The most immediate measure of Baldwin's legacy is chronological. He ruled for over a decade after the discovery of his illness, a span many contemporaries would have thought impossible. During that time, the kingdom did not disintegrate. Borders were held, institutions functioned, alliances were managed, even major external threats were contained or delayed. This continuity was not accidental. It resulted from choices Baldwin made repeatedly, often against pressure, and always within narrowing limits. Baldwin's approach to leadership was defined by acceptance of constraint. He did not pretend to possess strength he lacked. He did not pursue glory that would overextend his resources. He recognized that survival depended on time to negotiate, time to recover, time to prepare. His illness sharpened this perspective. Knowing that his own time was limited, he treated the kingdom's time as a resource to be conserved rather than spent. This philosophy distinguished him from many contemporaries. Crusader culture often emphasized boldness, decisive action, and visible courage. Baldwin did not reject these values, but he subordinated them to realism. His victory at Montgisard showed that he could act decisively when circumstances aligned. The rarity of such actions shows that he understood how easily decisive action could become reckless assertion. One of Baldwin's most significant contributions was institutional rather than personal. His reign strengthened habits of governance that did not rely entirely on the king's presence. Councils gained authority, delegation became routine, written orders and seals carried weight. These developments were driven by necessity, but they outlasted him. They allowed the kingdom to function during his withdrawal and immediately after his death. Without them, collapse would have come sooner. Baldwin's management of diplomacy stands out in retrospect. He treated truces not as moral commitments but as strategic tools. He enforced them consistently and worked to contain those who violated them. This consistency built credibility, even among enemies. Saladin's willingness to negotiate repeatedly with Jerusalem during Baldwin's reign reflects recognition of that credibility. Baldwin did not eliminate hostility, but he regulated it. His handling of internal division was equally important. The kingdom he ruled was never united in sentiment or ambition. Baldwin did not attempt to impose unity by force. Instead, he managed equilibrium. He limited the authority of destabilizing figures without provoking open conflict. He balanced factions through appointments and restraint. These efforts did not resolve rivalries, but they prevented them from becoming destructive during his lifetime. Succession remains the most contested aspect of Baldwin's legacy. His arrangements were fragile, and they failed to prevent collapse after his death. Yet judging them by outcome alone obscures context. Baldwin faced options that were all deeply flawed. He chose those that maximized legitimacy and delayed confrontation. The fact that these measures did not endure under different leadership does not negate their effectiveness under his own. The contrast between Baldwin's reign and what followed sharpens this assessment. Under leaders more inclined toward assertion than restraint, the kingdom moved rapidly toward catastrophe. Provocations multiplied, diplomatic space narrowed. Decisions were made under urgency rather than calculation. The result was not merely military defeat, but systemic failure. Baldwin's reign, by contrast, had postponed that failure for years. In memory, Baldwin IV occupies an unusual position. He was not a conqueror, reformer, or founder. He did not leave behind monuments or lasting dynasties. His significance lies in what he prevented rather than what he achieved. This makes his legacy less visible but no less substantial. History often favors builders and destroyers. Baldwin was a maintainer. His illness, once seen as a defining weakness, becomes central to understanding his leadership. It forced him to govern without illusion. He could not rely on personal charisma or force. He had to persuade, negotiate, and balance. These skills were not compensations for illness. They were adaptations that shaped his entire reign. Contemporary chroniclers recognize this, even if they struggled to articulate it fully. They described Baldwin as serious, attentive, and persistent. They noted his composure and judgment. They did not portray him as heroic in the conventional sense. Instead, they recorded a king who did his duty under circumstances that would have overwhelmed many. Later generations have sometimes romanticized Baldwin as a tragic figure or a symbol of suffering kingship. Such portrayals miss the substance of his rule. Baldwin did not govern tragically, he governed practically. His illness was a condition, not a narrative. He did not seek meaning in suffering. He sought continuity in governance. The broader historical impact of Baldwin's reign is inseparable from the story of the Crusades themselves. By delaying the fall of Jerusalem, he altered the timing and character of subsequent events. The Third Crusade, the reconfiguration of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the memory of Crusader rule were all shaped by the years Baldwin held the kingdom together. Delay changed context. Context changed response. Baldwin's reign also offers a lesson about leadership under constraint. Power does not always flow from strength. Sometimes it flows from credibility, consistency, and restraint. Baldwin's authority endured because it was accepted, not because it was enforced relentlessly. When acceptance vanished under his successors, enforcement alone proved insufficient. In evaluating Baldwin IV, it is important to avoid exaggeration. He did not save the kingdom of Jerusalem. He did not defeat Saladin. He did not resolve the structural weaknesses of Crusader rule. What he did was manage those weaknesses with unusual clarity. He bought time in a situation where time was the most valuable resource. That achievement becomes more apparent as distance increases. The speed of collapse after his death highlights how much Baldwin's presence had mattered. The fact that the kingdom functioned at all during his severe illness underscores the effectiveness of his adaptations. His reign was not successful because it ended in victory. It was successful because it delayed defeat under conditions that made defeat likely. Baldwin IV's legacy is therefore quiet, restrained, and easily overlooked. It does not lend itself to legend. It resists simplification. Yet it endures precisely because it demonstrates how leadership can function without ideal conditions. His reign shows that endurance, when paired with judgment, can shape history as decisively as conquest. The frail king did not command the future. He managed the present long enough to matter. In doing so, he left behind a model of responsibility under constraint that remains relevant far beyond his own time.